Welcome, guardian of Gotham's darkest secrets, to a journey through the twisted corridors and haunted halls of Arkham Asylum, where madness dwells behind bars of steel and stone. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of this infamous institution, from its tragic founding by Amadeus Arkham to its endless cycle of corruption and rebirth. Let the whispered confessions of the insane and the echoing footsteps through empty wards carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace every shadow that has fallen across this monument to human frailty. Close your eyes, keeper of nightmares, and let these tales of psychiatric horror unfold like pages from a forbidden journal. In the rolling hills beyond Gotham City, where morning mist clung to ancient oaks and the weight of generations pressed down upon weathered stone, there stood a mansion that would become synonymous with madness itself. The Arkham estate had been home to wealth and respectability for over a century, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven while its foundations sank deep into soil that seemed to hunger for sorrow. It was here, in 1865, that Elizabeth Arkham first drew breath. Though from her earliest moments it seemed as if she carried within her fragile frame the seeds of a darkness that would consume not only her own life, but cast shadows across decades yet to come. Elizabeth's childhood was marked by episodes that her family dismissed as nervous disorders, the kind of feminine hysteria that Victorian medicine neither understood nor knew how to treat with anything approaching genuine compassion. She would speak to empty corners of rooms, carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions whose presence seemed more real to her than the flesh and blood relatives who watched her with growing concern and mounting dread. The mirrors in her room had to be covered after she began screaming at her own reflection, claiming that the woman looking back at her was not herself but some malevolent doppelganger intent on stealing her very soul. As Elizabeth matured into womanhood, her condition neither improved nor stabilized, but instead evolved into something more complex and more terrifying. The doctors who examined her spoke in hushed tones about hereditary madness, about bloodline curses that passed from mother to child, like some genetic plague that no amount of prayer or medical intervention could hope to cure. Her marriage to the elder Amadeus Arkham was arranged not from love but from necessity, a union designed to provide her with the stability and care that her condition required while ensuring that the family's considerable wealth would not be lost to the state or to distant relatives who had never known the burden of her affliction. The birth of Batman X Hours Arkham Asylum. Welcome, guardian of Gotham's darkest secrets, to a journey through the twisted corridors and haunted halls of Arkham Asylum, where madness dwells behind bars of steel and stone. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of this infamous institution, from its tragic founding by Amadeus Arkham to its endless cycle of corruption and rebirth. Let the whispered confessions of the insane and the echoing footsteps through empty wards carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace every shadow that has fallen across this monument to human frailty. Close your eyes, keeper of nightmares, and let these tales of psychiatric horror unfold like pages from a forbidden journal. In the rolling hills beyond Gotham City, where morning mist clung to ancient oaks and the weight of generations pressed down upon weathered stone, there stood a mansion that would become synonymous with madness itself. The Arkham estate had been home to wealth and respectability for over a century, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven while its foundations sank deep into soil that seemed to hunger for sorrow. It was here, in 1865, that Elizabeth Arkham first drew breath. Though from her earliest moments it seemed as if she carried within her fragile frame the seeds of a darkness that would consume not only her own life, but cast shadows across decades yet to come. Elizabeth's childhood was marked by episodes that her family dismissed as nervous disorders, the kind of feminine hysteria that Victorian medicine neither understood nor knew how to treat with anything approaching genuine compassion. She would speak to empty corners of rooms, carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions whose presence seemed more real to her than the flesh and blood relatives who watched her with growing concern and mounting dread. The mirrors in her room had to be covered after she began screaming at her own reflection, claiming that the woman looking back at her was not herself but some malevolent doppelganger intent on stealing her very soul. As Elizabeth matured into womanhood, her condition neither improved nor stabilized, but instead evolved into something more complex and more terrifying. The doctors who examined her spoke in hushed tones about hereditary madness, about bloodline curses that passed from mother to child, like some genetic plague that no amount of prayer or medical intervention could hope to cure. Her marriage to the elder Amadeus Arkham was arranged not from love but from necessity, a union designed to provide her with the stability and care that her condition required while ensuring that the family's considerable wealth would not be lost to the state or to distant relatives who had never known the burden of her affliction. The birth of her son, the younger Amadeus, who would one day transform the family estate into an asylum for the criminally insane, seemed to provide Elizabeth with a brief respite from her mental torment. For the first years of his life, she was present and attentive, a loving mother whose illness retreated into the background like a dormant volcano that might never again threaten eruption. Yet even during these peaceful interludes, those who knew her best could see the warning signs that suggested her condition was merely waiting, gathering strength for a return that would prove more devastating than any of her previous episodes. The child Amadeus grew up in an atmosphere of constant vigilance, where every word his mother spoke was analyzed for signs of returning madness, and every moment of apparent normalcy was treasured as a gift that might be snatched away without warning. He learned to read the subtle changes in her expression that preceded her episodes, the way her eyes would lose focus and seem to peer into dimensions that existed beyond normal perception. Most disturbing of all were the nights when he would awaken to find her standing beside his bed, perfectly still and silent, watching him sleep with an expression that seemed to combine maternal love with something far more unsettling. The incident that would forever scar young Amadeus's understanding of reality occurred on a storm-swept evening in 1877, when he had barely reached his 12th year. He had brought his mother her evening meal, a simple tray of bread and soup that she had requested earlier in the day. As he entered her dimly lit chamber, she smiled at him with what appeared to be genuine warmth and told him that she had already eaten, that he need not have troubled himself with bringing her sustenance she no longer required. It was then that the beetles began to emerge from between her lips. Dozens of black-shelled insects that crawled across her face and fell to the floor with tiny clicking sounds that seemed to echo through the room like drops of rain on a coffin lid. The rational part of Amadeus's mind understood, even at his young age, that his mother had somehow consumed the insects, that her claim of having already eaten was literally true in the most horrifying possible way. Yet her explanation for this grotesque meal spoke to deeper currents of meaning that his developing intellect struggled to comprehend. She told him that the beetles represented rebirth, transformation from one state of being to another, and that by consuming them she was participating in a sacred ritual that would allow her consciousness to transcend the limitations of her diseased mind and emerge into a realm where madness and sanity were merely arbitrary distinctions, imposed by those who feared true understanding. The psychological impact of witnessing this scene would resonate through every aspect of Amadeus's subsequent development, creating fault lines in his character that would eventually crack open under the pressure of adult responsibilities and professional obligations. He began to understand that the world contained forms of suffering and degradation that polite society refused to acknowledge, horrors that lurked behind the facades of respectability and normalcy that his social class worked so desperately to maintain. His mother's illness became for him a window into abysses of human experience that most people never glimpsed and would refuse to believe if confronted with evidence of their existence. The years that followed were marked by Elizabeth's gradual retreat from any pretense of conventional behavior or social engagement. She would spend days locked in her room, emerging only for brief periods during which she would wander the mansion's corridors like a ghost searching for something that could never be found. The servants learned to avoid her during these episodes, crossing themselves and muttering prayers when they encountered her pale figure drifting through rooms that seemed to grow colder in her presence. Even the family's physician, a man of considerable experience with nervous disorders, confessed his inability to understand or treat her condition, recommending only that she be kept comfortable and prevented from harming herself or others. As Amadeus entered adolescence and began his formal education, he found himself torn between his desire to escape the oppressive atmosphere of his family home and his sense of duty toward a mother whose condition continued to deteriorate despite all efforts at intervention. His academic achievements were remarkable, marking him as a student of exceptional intellectual gifts. Yet his teachers noted a certain detachment in his manner that suggested depths of experience far beyond his chronological age. He excelled particularly in subjects that dealt with the human mind and its disorders, displaying an intuitive understanding of psychological principles that seemed to emerge from personal familiarity with madness rather than mere theoretical study. The transformation of Elizabeth's condition in the final years of her life represented a descent into forms of mental chaos that defied medical classification or rational explanation. She began to claim that the mansion itself was alive, a vast organism that fed on the emotions and memories of its inhabitants while slowly transforming them into components of its own consciousness. The walls, she insisted, were not mere structural elements, but sensory organs that allowed the house to perceive everything that occurred within its boundaries, while the floors served as a digestive system that broke down and absorbed the psychic residue left by decades of human habitation. During her lucid moments, which became increasingly rare as her condition progressed, Elizabeth would speak to her son about the visions that filled her waking hours and haunted her dreams. She described vast cities of impossible architecture, where the laws of physics operated according to principles that human science could never hope to understand, populated by beings whose forms of consciousness bore no resemblance to anything that had ever evolved on Earth. These visions, she claimed, were not hallucinations, but glimpses of realities that existed parallel to the mundane world that ordinary people mistook for the totality of existence. Most disturbing of all were her references to a presence that she called the Bat Thing, a creature of shadow and malevolence that seemed to exist at the intersection of nightmare and prophecy. This entity, according to Elizabeth's fevered accounts, was intimately connected to their family's destiny, a force of chaos that would one day manifest itself in physical form to challenge everything that the Arkham bloodline had built and treasured. She spoke of this creature with a mixture of terror and anticipation, as if she understood that its eventual arrival would bring both destruction and a twisted form of fulfillment that her tortured mind could barely comprehend. The burden of caring for Elizabeth during her final decline fell primarily upon young Amadeus, who had returned from his university studies to assume responsibility for the family estate and its increasingly complex obligations. He found himself caught between his professional training in psychiatric medicine and the emotional reality of watching his mother's complete surrender to forces that seemed to operate beyond the reach of scientific understanding or therapeutic intervention. The textbooks and case studies that had filled his academic years seemed woefully inadequate when confronted with the living reality of inherited madness and its progressive destruction of human dignity. The decision that would haunt Amadeus for the remainder of his own life came on a night when Elizabeth's suffering had reached levels that seemed to transcend anything that human consciousness should be required to endure. She had been awake for nearly a week, pacing her room and speaking in languages that bore no resemblance to any known human tongue, her voice rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication with entities whose existence could neither be proven nor disproven. When she finally collapsed from exhaustion, her body racked by convulsions that seemed to originate from some source deeper than mere physical distress. Amadeus found himself faced with a choice that would define the trajectory of his entire future. The mercy that he showed his mother in her final moments was an act of love corrupted by desperation, compassion twisted into something that resembled murder more closely than healing. The pillow that he pressed over her face was intended to end her suffering rather than her life. Yet the distinction between these two concepts became meaningless in the face of her final struggles and the terrible silence that followed. The memory of that night would be buried so deeply in his unconscious mind that he would spend years believing that Elizabeth had died naturally, victim of the same hereditary madness that had claimed other members of their bloodline across previous generations. The inheritance that came to Amadeus following his mother's death encompassed not only the family's considerable wealth and property, but also the psychological legacy of her illness and the guilt associated with his role in ending her suffering. The mansion that had been his childhood home now felt like a mausoleum, filled with memories of conversations with invisible companions and the lingering echoes of her final inhuman screams. Yet rather than flee from these reminders of trauma and loss, he chose to embrace them, to transform the sight of personal tragedy into something that might serve a larger purpose in addressing the broader human condition. The vision that began to form in Amadeus's mind during those first months of solitary residence in the family mansion was both altruistic and deeply personal, a plan to create an institution that would provide the kind of compassionate care for the mentally ill that his mother had never received. He understood from personal experience that madness was not a moral failing or spiritual weakness, but a medical condition that deserved treatment rather than punishment, understanding rather than fear. The transformation of Arkham Manor into an asylum for those whose minds had been broken by trauma, disease, or hereditary disposition seemed like a fitting memorial to Elizabeth's memory and a constructive use of the resources that her death had placed at his disposal. Yet even as he began planning the practical details of this ambitious undertaking, Amadeus could not escape the feeling that forces beyond his understanding were shaping his decisions and guiding his actions toward ends that he could not clearly perceive. The mansion itself seemed to approve of his plans, its rooms and corridors taking on a sense of expectancy that suggested they had always been intended for purposes far removed from ordinary domestic life. The architectural modifications that would be necessary to transform a family residence into a medical facility began to seem less like impositions upon the building's original design than revelations of its true nature, as if the structure had been waiting decades for someone with the vision and resources necessary to fulfill its ultimate destiny. The psychological transformation that accompanied Amadeus's assumption of his new role was gradual but profound, marking the beginning of a process that would eventually consume his sanity as thoroughly as hereditary madness had claimed his mother's mind. The compassion that motivated his desire to help the mentally ill was genuine and deep, rooted in personal experience of the inadequacy of conventional psychiatric treatment and the cruelty that often accompanied society's attempts to deal with conditions it could neither understand nor cure. Yet, this very compassion contained within it the seeds of an obsession that would eventually lead him down paths of moral compromise and psychological destruction that were every bit as devastating as the illnesses he sought to treat. The irony that would define Amadeus Arkham's ultimate fate was already apparent to those who knew him best during the early years of his professional career. In seeking to heal others, he was unconsciously attempting to heal himself, to find meaning and purpose in the trauma of his mother's death that would justify the guilt and sorrow that had shaped his adult personality. The asylum that he created in her memory was as much a monument to his own psychological needs as it was a response to the broader social problem of caring for the mentally ill. And this fundamental confusion of personal and professional motivations would eventually prove to be the foundation upon which his own madness would be constructed. The legacy of Elizabeth Arkham lived on not only in the institution that bore her family's name, but in the hereditary predisposition to mental illness that she had passed to her son, along with the more tangible aspects of his inheritance. The madness that had consumed her would find new expression in his own psychological development, manifesting itself not as hallucinations and delusions but as a form of moral blindness that would allow him to justify increasingly extreme actions in service of goals that seemed noble and altruistic on their surface yet concealed depths of corruption and self-deception that would eventually rival anything found in the minds of the patients he claimed to be helping. The transformation of the Arkham family mansion into an asylum for the criminally insane represented both the fulfillment of a noble vision and the beginning of a cycle of corruption and violence that would continue for generations, claiming victims among both patients and staff while perpetuating the very forms of suffering and madness that it had been designed to eliminate. In seeking to create a sanctuary for healing, Amadeus Arkham had instead constructed a monument to the hereditary curse that had shaped his family's destiny, ensuring that the darkness which had consumed his mother would find new ways to express itself through the institution that bore her name and carried forward her legacy of madness and despair. The stones themselves seemed to remember suffering, each weathered block and crumbling mortar joint holding within its crystalline structure the accumulated anguish of centuries spent witnessing humanity's descent into madness and despair. The original Arkham Manor had been constructed in the 1700s, when Gothic revival architecture was seen not merely as an aesthetic choice but as a spiritual statement, a declaration that beauty could emerge from darkness and that human creativity could transform even the most forbidding materials into expressions of transcendent meaning. Yet from its earliest days, the mansion that would eventually house Gotham's most notorious asylum seemed to attract tragedy and misfortune with an almost supernatural magnetism, as if its very design contained architectural principles that resonated with the frequencies of human suffering. The facade that greeted visitors approached the estate through its wrought iron gates was deliberately imposing, designed to inspire both awe and a certain measure of unease in those who encountered it for the first time. Twin towers flanked the main entrance, their pointed spires reaching toward heaven like accusing fingers, while their narrow windows gazed down upon the surrounding landscape with expressions that seemed both watchful and predatory. The massive oak doors that served as the primary entrance were carved with religious motifs that had been selected not for their conventional Christian symbolism, but for their representation of divine judgment and eternal punishment. Themes that would prove prophetic, given the building's eventual function as a repository for souls deemed beyond redemption by conventional society. The architectural influence that shaped the mansion's design drew heavily from the medieval tradition of cathedral construction, incorporating elements that were intended to elevate the human spirit through encounters with the sublime and the terrible. Flying buttresses supported walls that rose to impossible heights, their stone surfaces carved with gargoyles and grotesques that seemed to move in the shifting light of dawn and dusk. These decorative elements were not merely ornamental, but served as visual reminders of the thin boundary between the sacred and the profane, between the civilized order that human society struggled to maintain and the chaos that lurked perpetually at its borders. The interior spaces of the original manor reflected the same Gothic sensibility that had informed its external appearance, though here, the architectural elements served different psychological purposes. The great hall that served as the building's ceremonial heart was designed to dwarf human visitors, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to suggest infinite vertical space, while its stone floor created echoes that transformed every footstep into a reminder of mortality and the passage of time. The windows that provided illumination for this central space were fitted with stained glass that depicted scenes from classical mythology and biblical scripture, though these images had been selected with particular attention to themes of madness, possession, and divine retribution. The influence of Howard Phillips Lovecraft's fictional Arkham Sanatorium upon the real-world asylum that bore a similar name was neither coincidental nor superficial, but rather reflected deep currents of architectural and psychological symbolism that connected Gothic Revival design principles to broader cultural anxieties about the nature of consciousness and the stability of human reason. Lovecraft's sanatorium had been described as a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare became permeable, where the geometric relationships that normally governed three-dimensional space were subtly distorted in ways that created profound unease in those sensitive enough to perceive them. The architects who had designed the Arkham family mansion had unconsciously incorporated similar principles, creating spatial relationships that seemed to violate human expectations about proportion, symmetry, and the logical progression from one room to another. The corridors that connected the mansion's various chambers were perhaps the most psychologically unsettling aspect of its internal architecture, designed according to principles that seemed to prioritize symbolic meaning over practical functionality. These passages curved and branched in patterns that defied easy memorization, creating a labyrinthine structure that could disorient even long-time residents and staff members who had spent years navigating its complexities. The lighting in these corridors was provided by fixtures that cast shadows in unexpected directions, while the placement of doorways and intersections seemed calculated to create moments of confusion and uncertainty for anyone attempting to move through the building with purpose and confidence. When Amadeus Arkham inherited the family estate and began planning its transformation from private residence to medical facility, he found that the building's existing architecture seemed almost perfectly suited to his intended purpose, as if previous generations of his family had unconsciously prepared the structure for its eventual role as a sanctuary for the mentally ill. The high ceilings and thick walls that had originally been designed to impress visitors with the family's wealth and status now provided the security and containment capabilities that would be necessary for housing patients whose conditions made them potentially dangerous to themselves and others. The numerous small rooms that had once served as servants' quarters could be easily converted into individual cells, while the mansion's isolation from neighboring properties ensured that disturbances from within would not alarm the broader community. The modifications that were required to adapt the mansion for psychiatric use were extensive yet seemed to emerge naturally from the building's original design, as if the Gothic Revival architects who had planned its construction had somehow anticipated its eventual function. The installation of bars on windows was accomplished without compromising the aesthetic integrity of the stained glass, while the addition of heavy locks and security systems seemed to complement rather than contradict the medieval atmosphere that pervaded every room and corridor. Most significantly, the basement levels that had originally served as storage and mechanical spaces were expanded and reinforced to create isolation chambers for patients whose conditions required complete separation from external stimuli. The symbolic importance that Amadeus placed upon mirrors throughout the facility reflected his understanding of their role in both psychological diagnosis and treatment, yet also revealed his growing obsession with questions of identity and the relationship between external appearance and internal reality. Every major room in the converted asylum was equipped with large mirrors positioned to provide multiple perspectives on the same space, creating visual effects that could be either therapeutic or deeply disturbing depending upon the mental state of those who encountered them. For patients struggling with dissociative disorders, these mirrors could serve as tools for reconnecting fragmented aspects of personality, while for others they became sources of terror and confusion that amplified existing delusions and paranoid ideation. The doors that connected the asylum's various sections were designed and positioned according to principles that reflected both practical security needs and deeper symbolic concerns about passage between different states of being. The main entrance doors were massive and forbidding, requiring considerable physical effort to open and creating sounds that announced the arrival or departure of every individual who crossed the threshold. Interior doors were fitted with observation panels that allowed staff to monitor patients without direct contact. Yet these same panels could become sources of paranoid anxiety for inmates who felt constantly watched and evaluated by unseen authorities. The basement levels of the converted mansion represented perhaps the most significant departure from the building's original residential function. Transformed through extensive excavation and construction into an underground complex that served multiple purposes in the asylum's operations. These subterranean spaces housed the facility's most dangerous patients, those whose conditions required complete isolation from both other inmates and the outside world. The cells in these lower levels were carved directly from bedrock, their walls weeping moisture that created an atmosphere of perpetual dampness and decay that seemed to reflect the psychological state of those confined within them. The expansion of the asylum's physical plant over subsequent decades reflected both growing patient populations and evolving understanding of psychiatric treatment, though these architectural modifications often seemed guided more by practical necessity than therapeutic theory. Additional wings were added to accommodate specialized populations, with separate sections for violent patients, those suffering from specific forms of mental illness, and individuals whose conditions required particular forms of medical intervention. Yet, despite these rational planning considerations, the new construction invariably incorporated Gothic elements that maintained continuity with the original mansion's aesthetic, as if the building itself demanded adherence to certain architectural principles that transcended mere functional requirements. The various locations that served as homes for the asylum throughout its history reflected the institution's troubled relationship with the broader Gotham community and the practical challenges of housing a population that society preferred to forget. The original manor house provided an isolated setting that protected both patients and the general public from unwanted contact. Yet this very isolation contributed to the development of an institutional culture that operated according to its own rules and values, often in direct contradiction to accepted medical and ethical standards. When the facility was relocated to Mercy Island, the geographic separation became even more pronounced, creating a physical barrier that symbolized the psychological distance between the asylum and the civilization it claimed to serve. Mercy Island itself possessed a history that seemed to predestine it for its eventual role as a repository for human suffering and institutional failure. The island had been purchased in the late 1800s by Eric Mercy, a cement magnate whose wealth had been built upon providing materials for construction projects throughout the rapidly expanding metropolis of Gotham. Mercy's mansion on the island had been designed as a retreat from the pressures of urban industrial life. Yet the isolation that made it attractive as a private residence also made it an ideal location for activities that required concealment from public scrutiny. The Gothic mansion that Mercy had constructed on his private island incorporated architectural elements that seemed to echo and amplify those found in the original Arkham estate, creating visual and psychological continuities that suggested deeper connections between the two locations than mere coincidence could explain. The building's towers and battlements commanded panoramic views of Gotham's skyline, yet their windows faced inward as often as outward, creating spaces that felt simultaneously expansive and claustrophobic. The mansion's numerous rooms were connected by passages that seemed to follow no rational plan, creating a maze-like structure that could disorient visitors and residents alike. When Jeremiah Arkham assumed control of the asylum and initiated his comprehensive redesign of the facility, his architectural vision reflected both modern understanding of psychiatric treatment and deeper psychological compulsions that connected him to his family's legacy of madness and obsession. The circular labyrinth that formed the centerpiece of his new design was intended to serve practical purposes related to patient supervision and staff efficiency. Yet its symbolic implications were far more complex and disturbing. The maze-like structure seemed to suggest that madness itself was a puzzle to be solved through systematic navigation, yet also implied that those who entered its passages might become permanently lost within its confusing geometries. The glass observation walls that Jeremiah installed throughout the new facility represented a radical departure from traditional asylum architecture, replacing the solid barriers that had previously separated patients from staff with transparent partitions that allowed constant surveillance while creating new forms of psychological pressure and vulnerability. These transparent walls were intended to promote therapeutic transparency and prevent the kinds of abuse that had historically characterized institutional psychiatry. Yet they also eliminated privacy and created fishbowl environments that could exacerbate the very conditions they were meant to treat. The security systems that were integrated into successive iterations of the asylum reflected evolving understanding of both the capabilities of the patient population and the threats they posed to themselves and others. The anti-riot gas systems installed during the 1980s were designed to incapacitate entire sections of the facility without permanent harm to those exposed, yet their very existence created an atmosphere of potential chemical warfare that contributed to the institutional paranoia that pervaded every aspect of daily life within the asylum's walls. The electrified fencing that surrounded the facility served obvious security functions, yet also created symbolic boundaries that reinforced the perception of the asylum as a prison rather than a hospital. The underground tunnel systems that connected various parts of the asylum complex served both practical and psychological purposes, providing secure pathways for staff movement while also creating hidden spaces that could be used for activities that required concealment from official oversight. These subterranean passages were carved from the bedrock beneath Gotham, their walls bearing tool marks and architectural details that suggested construction techniques dating back centuries before the asylum's official founding. The existence of these tunnels implied histories and purposes that predated the facility's medical mission, connecting it to older and darker traditions of confinement and punishment. The architectural psychology that governed the asylum's design reflected deep-seated cultural assumptions about the nature of mental illness and the appropriate methods for its treatment. Assumptions that often contradicted official therapeutic philosophies while expressing themselves through spatial relationships and environmental conditions. The high walls and narrow windows that characterized most of the facility's patient areas were justified in terms of security and suicide prevention. Yet they also created prison-like environments that could worsen depression and claustrophobia while reinforcing patients' sense of separation from the outside world. The symbolic importance of the asylum's physical structure extended beyond its immediate practical functions to encompass broader questions about the relationship between architecture and consciousness, between environmental design and psychological health. The building seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence that expressed itself through mechanical failures, structural problems, and maintenance issues that consistently undermined efforts at reform and improvement. Pipes burst at crucial moments, electrical systems failed during emergencies, and structural elements collapsed without apparent cause, creating an ongoing sense of crisis that prevented staff from focusing on patient care. The comparison between Arkham Asylum and historical psychiatric institutions revealed both continuities and departures that illuminated broader trends in the treatment of mental illness and society's attitudes toward those whose both buns sauce. Conditions placed them outside normal social boundaries, like the notorious Bedlam Hospital in London, or the asylum system that characterized American psychiatry in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Arkham reflected the tendency of institutional psychiatry to prioritize containment over treatment, security over healing. Yet the asylum's connection to Gotham's unique population of supervillains and metahuman criminals created challenges that no historical precedent could adequately address. The environmental impact that the asylum's physical presence had upon its patients and staff was both subtle and profound, creating atmospheric conditions that seemed calculated to erode mental stability and moral clarity in all who spent extended periods within its walls. The quality of light that filtered through the facility's stained glass windows created chromatic effects that could trigger seizures in epileptic patients while contributing to seasonal affective disorders in those already struggling with depression. The acoustic properties of the building's stone construction amplified certain frequencies while dampening others, creating auditory environments that could exacerbate auditory hallucinations and paranoid ideation. The perception of the asylum as a living organism that fed upon the madness of its inhabitants was not merely a metaphorical construct but reflected genuine architectural and environmental characteristics that seemed to influence the plasticity, psychological states of all who encountered them. The building's heating and ventilation systems circulated air in patterns that created subtle pressure differentials, generating infrasonic frequencies that could induce anxiety and disorientation in sensitive individuals. The moisture that seeped through the facility's stone walls carried mineral deposits and organic compounds that created distinctive odors associated with decay and death, olfactory cues that could trigger traumatic memories and depressive episodes. The ultimate significance of Arkham Asylum's architectural evolution lay not in its practical success or failure as a medical facility, but in its function as a physical embodiment of society's deepest fears and most profound moral contradictions regarding the treatment of mental illness and the nature of human consciousness itself. The building stood as a monument to the proposition that some forms of human suffering were too dangerous or too alien to be accommodated within normal social structures, requiring instead specialized institutions that could contain and manage them without necessarily understanding or curing them. In its endless cycle of destruction and reconstruction, the asylum reflected humanity's ongoing struggle to balance compassion with security, healing with punishment, hope with the recognition that some forms of darkness might prove beyond the reach of any architectural solution or therapeutic intervention. The succession of individuals who assumed responsibility for managing Arkham Asylum's daily operations represented a chronicle of good intentions corrupted by institutional pressures, professional ambition undermined by moral compromise, and healing missions transformed into exercises in control and containment that served political expediency more faithfully than therapeutic principle. Each administrator who accepted the position of director brought with them unique qualifications, personal motivations, and philosophical approaches to the treatment of mental illness. Yet the asylum itself seemed to possess a malevolent capacity for corrupting even the most ethical and competent professionals, transforming healers into wardens and turning medical facilities into instruments of punishment and social control. Robert H. arrived at Arkham Asylum during one of its periodic crises of leadership, when scandals and security failures had created a vacuum of authority that threatened to destabilize not only the institution itself but the broader system of criminal justice that depended upon its continued operation. His appointment was viewed by many as a temporary measure, an interim solution designed to restore basic functionality and public confidence while more permanent arrangements could be negotiated. Yet H.'s background in correctional administration and his reputation for implementing effective security protocols made him uniquely qualified to address the immediate challenges that faced any director willing to accept responsibility for Gotham's most notorious and dangerous inmates. The administrative philosophy that H brought to his role reflected his understanding that Arkham's primary function was containment rather than treatment, a pragmatic acknowledgement that many of the facility's inmates posed threats to public safety that far exceeded any reasonable hope for therapeutic intervention or successful rehabilitation. This perspective was not born from callousness or indifference to human suffering, but from years of experience managing populations whose criminal behaviors and psychological profiles placed them beyond the reach of conventional psychiatric treatment. His focus on security improvements and operational efficiency was intended to create stable conditions that might eventually permit more ambitious therapeutic programs. Yet the urgency of immediate crises consistently prevented such long-term planning from moving beyond the conceptual stage. The relationship that developed between H and Batman represented an unprecedented collaboration between institutional psychiatry and vigilante law enforcement, a partnership that violated numerous ethical principles and legal protocols while serving practical purposes that both parties recognized as essential to maintaining Gotham's fragile stability. H's willingness to provide Batman with direct access to patients for interrogation and consultation reflected his pragmatic understanding that conventional channels of information sharing were inadequate to address the unique template challenges posed by Arkham's metahuman and supervillain population. These informal arrangements operated outside official oversight and accountability structures, creating opportunities for abuse and misconduct that would have been unacceptable in any conventional medical facility. The security improvements that H implemented during his tenure as interim director represented significant advances in both technological capability and operational procedure, though these enhancements were often undermined by the fundamental structural and architectural limitations that characterized the asylum's physical plant. The installation of anti-riot gas systems throughout the facility was designed to provide staff with non-lethal means of controlling large-scale disturbances without resorting to potentially lethal force. Yet the system's deployment required careful coordination and timing that proved difficult to achieve during actual emergency situations. The gas itself could cause respiratory complications in patients with pre-existing medical conditions, while its psychological effects often exacerbated paranoid ideation and claustrophobic responses that were already problematic among the inmate population. The decision to arm security guards with firearms represented a dramatic departure from traditional psychiatric facility protocols, reflecting H's assessment that Arkham's unique patient population required security measures that prioritized staff safety over therapeutic considerations. This policy change was justified by documented incidents in which unarmed staff members had been killed or seriously injured by inmates whose superhuman abilities or technological resources rendered conventional restraint methods ineffective. Yet the presence of armed personnel within a medical facility created an atmosphere of potential violence that could be profoundly counterproductive to therapeutic goals, while increasing the likelihood that patient-staff conflicts would escalate to lethal outcomes. The administrative culture that emerged under H leadership reflected his corrections background and his understanding of the facility as a specialized form of prison rather than a hospital, an institutional identity that influenced every aspect of daily operations and staff behavior. Patient care was subordinated to security concerns, with medical decisions often made on the basis of their impact on facility safety rather than therapeutic value. The training programs that H implemented for new staff members emphasized crowd control techniques and crisis management protocols while providing minimal instruction in psychiatric nursing or therapeutic communication. This approach created a workforce that was well prepared to handle riots and escapes but poorly equipped to address the complex psychological needs of patients whose conditions required sophisticated medical intervention. The scandals that occurred during H's administration, including the Joker's escape during the events that would later be chronicled as the Killing Joke, revealed both the inherent limitations of security-focused management and the extraordinary challenges posed by Forfest. inmates whose capabilities exceeded anything that conventional correctional facilities were designed to contain. The Joker's use of a body double to facilitate his escape demonstrated a level of planning and resource allocation that suggested extensive external support networks, while his ability to manipulate staff members and exploit security vulnerabilities indicated systematic weaknesses in the asylum's operational procedures that no amount of technological enhancement could fully address. The partnership between H and Batman, while operationally effective in many respects, created ethical dilemmas that reflected broader tensions between public safety imperatives and medical confidentiality requirements. Between the need for information sharing and the protection of patient rights, Batman's requests for patient interviews and access to medical records placed H in positions where he was forced to choose between legal compliance and practical cooperation with Gotham's most effective crime-fighting resource. The informal agreements that governed these interactions operated outside established protocols for information sharing between medical institutions and law enforcement agencies, creating precedents that could be exploited by less scrupulous administrators or used to justify more egregious violations of patient privacy and autonomy. The retirement that H ultimately chose represented both personal exhaustion from the overwhelming demands of the position and professional recognition that the asylum's fundamental problems exceeded the capacity of any single administrator to resolve. Through conventional management approaches, his recommendation of Jeremiah Arkham as his successor reflected his belief that the facility required leadership that combined medical expertise with deep understanding of the institution's unique history and culture, qualities that Jeremiah possessed by virtue of his family connection to the asylum's founding and his professional training in psychiatric medicine. Jeremiah Arkham's assumption of the directorship marked a dramatic shift in both the asylum's operational philosophy and its physical configuration, changes that reflected his vision of modern psychiatric treatment integrated with respect for his family's legacy and commitment to honoring the therapeutic ideals that had originally motivated his uncle's creation of the FACE institution. His decision to demolish the existing facility and construct an entirely new complex represented both a practical response to the structural limitations of the converted mansion and a symbolic rejection of the custodial approach that had characterized previous administrations. The demolition process itself took on ritualistic significance, with Jeremiah personally overseeing the destruction of elements that he viewed as corrupted by decades of institutional failure and moral compromise. The burning of Amadeus Arkham's diary and the destruction of historical records from the facility's early years represented Jeremiah's attempt to create a clean break with the past, while also eliminating evidence of practices and incidents that might compromise his efforts at reform and modernization. This decision reflected his understanding that institutional change required not only new policies and procedures, but also the elimination of organizational memory and cultural traditions that might resist or undermine innovation. Yet the destruction of these historical documents also represented a form of institutional amnesia that prevented future administrators from learning from past mistakes while eliminating accountability for previous misconduct and systemic failures. The architectural vision that guided Jeremiah's reconstruction of the facility incorporated both cutting-edge therapeutic design principles and symbolic elements that connected the new structure to the Gothic traditions that had characterized his family's estate and its previous incarnations as a psychiatric institution. The circular labyrinth that formed the centerpiece of his design was intended to facilitate therapeutic navigation through psychological complexity, while also serving practical purposes related to security and staff efficiency. The maze-like structure reflected contemporary understanding of the mind as a complex system of interconnected pathways and decision points. Yet its implementation created spatial relationships that could be deeply disorienting and psychologically destabilizing for patients whose conditions already included elements of confusion and disorientation. The glass observation walls that Jeremiah installed throughout the new facility represented his commitment to transparency and accountability in patient care, eliminating the hidden spaces and unsupervised interactions that had enabled abuse and misconduct in previous institutional configurations. These transparent barriers were designed to protect both patients and staff by ensuring that all interactions occurred under direct observation, while also facilitating the kind of continuous assessment and monitoring that modern psychiatric treatment required. Yet the elimination of privacy and the creation of fishbowl environments also generated new forms of psychological pressure and institutional voyeurism that could exacerbate existing symptoms while creating novel forms of institutional trauma. The therapeutic philosophy that guided Jeremiah's approach to patient care reflected his training in contemporary psychiatric methodology, while also incorporating elements of his family's traditional commitment to providing sanctuary for those whom society had abandoned or rejected. His emphasis on individual treatment planning and personalized therapeutic interventions represented significant advances over the one-size-fits-all approaches that had characterized previous administrations, while his willingness to experiment with innovative techniques and non-traditional therapies demonstrated intellectual flexibility and commitment to patient welfare that distinguished him from his more security-focused predecessors. The challenges that Jeremiah faced in implementing his reformist vision included not only resistance from staff members who had been trained under previous administrative cultures, but also external pressures from political and law enforcement agencies that prioritized public safety over therapeutic innovation. His efforts to create genuine therapeutic environments were consistently undermined by the reality that many of his patients were not voluntary admissions seeking help for treatable conditions, but court-ordered commitments whose presence in the facility reflected judicial decisions about public safety rather than medical assessments of treatment needs and prognosis. The relationship that Jeremiah developed with Batman represented both continuity with previous administrative practices and significant departure from the informal arrangements that had characterized H's approach to information, sharing, and consultation. Jeremiah's medical training and ethical commitments created tensions with Batman's investigative needs and operational methods, leading to conflicts over patient confidentiality and treatment priorities that reflected broader tensions between medical and law enforcement approaches to criminal behavior and mental illness. Dr. Cavendish's role as Asylum administrator under Jeremiah's directorship represented the institutionalization of therapeutic approaches that prioritized behavioral modification over understanding, compliance over healing, and staff convenience over patient welfare. His enthusiasm for electroshock therapy reflected both outdated medical practices and personal psychological tendencies that found satisfaction in the exercise of power over vulnerable individuals, characteristics that made him representative of institutional psychiatry's capacity for attracting professionals whose motivations were more aligned with control than caring. The electroshock therapy programs that Cavendish administered with such evident pleasure represented not therapeutic intervention, but institutionalized torture, procedures that were justified through medical language while serving primarily to punish non-compliance and demonstrate staff authority over patient autonomy. The frequency and intensity of these treatments far exceeded any reasonable medical protocol, while the selection criteria for patients who received them appeared to be based more on behavioral control considerations than clinical indications or therapeutic necessity. The corruption of medical ethics that characterized Cavendish's administration reflected broader, systemic problems within institutional psychiatry that extended far beyond individual moral failures to encompass structural incentives and cultural traditions that rewarded compliance and efficiency over genuine therapeutic engagement and patient advocacy. The asylum's isolation from external oversight and accountability mechanisms created conditions where abusive practices could flourish under the cover of medical authority, while the vulnerable status of the patient population made resistance to such abuse extremely difficult and rarely successful. The administrative failures that occurred during major crises revealed the inadequacy of management structures that prioritized appearance over substance, policy compliance over operational effectiveness, and bureaucratic procedure over emergency response capabilities. The systematic breakdowns that characterized the asylum's response to riots, escapes, and external attacks demonstrated that decades of administrative focus on control and containment had created organizational cultures that were fundamentally unprepared to address the dynamic challenges posed by their extraordinary patient populations. The psychological toll that administrative responsibility for Arkham Asylum imposed upon those who accepted leadership positions represented a form of occupational hazard that was rarely acknowledged or addressed through appropriate support structures and professional development programs. The constant exposure to extreme forms of human suffering and social pathology, combined with the moral compromises and ethical conflicts that characterize daily operations, created conditions that were profoundly damaging to mental health and professional integrity, even for individuals who entered their positions with genuine commitment to therapeutic ideals and patient welfare. The ultimate tragedy of Arkham Asylum's administrative history lay not in the failures of individual directors or the inadequacy of particular policies and procedures, but in the demonstration that institutional structures designed for control and containment were fundamentally incompatible with genuine therapeutic purposes, creating organizational cultures that corrupted even well-intentioned professionals while perpetuating cycles of abuse and neglect that served political and bureaucratic interests rather than the healing mission that had originally justified the institution's existence. The chaos that erupted within Arkham Asylum's walls during the infamous riot of 1989 represented far more than a simple breakdown of institutional security or failure of administrative control, but rather the inevitable consequence of decades of accumulated tensions between an inmate population whose capabilities exceeded human norms and a staff structure that remained fundamentally unprepared to address the unique challenges posed by Gotham's most dangerous criminals. The uprising that would become known as the April Fool's Massacre began not with random violence or spontaneous disorder, but with the methodical execution of a plan that had been years in development, orchestrated by minds whose capacity for strategic thinking rivaled that of military commanders while being unencumbered by moral restraints or legal limitations. The Joker's role in initiating and coordinating the rebellion reflected his unique position within the asylum's informal hierarchy, a status that derived not from physical intimidation or criminal reputation, but from his demonstrated ability to perceive patterns and exploit weaknesses that remained invisible to both staff and fellow inmates. His understanding of institutional psychology enabled him to identify the precise moments when security protocols would be most vulnerable to disruption, while his charismatic influence over other prisoners provided him with the human resources necessary to transform individual grievances into collective action that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated containment systems. The timing of the riot's commencement was calculated to coincide with shift changes and administrative transitions that left the facility temporarily understaffed and operating with reduced oversight capabilities, windows of vulnerability that the Joker had identified through months of careful observation and systematic analysis of daily routines. The initial phase of the uprising involved the simultaneous neutralization of key security positions throughout the facility, with coordinated attacks on guard stations, communications equipment, and monitoring systems that effectively blinded the institutional response, while creating confusion that prevented effective coordination between different sections of the complex. The hostage situations that developed during the early hours of the riot served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple human shields or bargaining chips, representing instead carefully orchestrated psychological warfare designed to maximize staff demoralization while demonstrating inmate capability for sophisticated operational planning. The selection of specific staff members for capture reflected detailed intelligence about their personal relationships, professional responsibilities, and psychological vulnerabilities, information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance and systematic exploitation of institutional security weaknesses. Pearl's apparent torture and mutilation during the Joker's initial negotiations with Batman represented a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined genuine threat with theatrical deception, creating emotional pressure designed to force hasty decision-making while simultaneously establishing the Joker's credentials as someone capable of unspeakable cruelty. The sounds of suffering that were transmitted through the communication system were crafted to maximize their impact on listeners who were forced to imagine horrors that exceeded anything they could directly witness. While the revelation that Pearl was actually unharmed and complicit in the deception demonstrated the Joker's understanding of how perception could be more powerful than reality in determining behavioral responses. The demands that the inmates presented during their negotiations with authorities reflected not practical desires for improved conditions or legitimate grievances about institutional treatment, but rather carefully calculated requests designed to waste time while creating confusion about the uprising's true objectives and ultimate goals. The requests for furniture, food, and clothing were deliberately mundane and reasonable, creating the impression of rational leadership while concealing the chaotic and destructive intentions that actually motivated the rebellion. The demand to speak directly with Batman revealed the Joker's understanding that the Asylum's problems were intimately connected to Gotham's broader ecosystem of crime and vigilante justice. The psychological dynamics that governed interactions between different inmate factions during the riot revealed complex social hierarchies and alliance structures that had developed over years of shared confinement, relationships that reflected not only individual personalities and criminal specializations, but also deeper patterns of dominance and submission that characterized the Asylum's unofficial power structures. The cooperation between traditional enemies like the Joker and Two-Face demonstrated how external threats could temporarily unite individuals whose fundamental interests remained irreconcilably opposed, while the isolation of certain inmates revealed the existence of social boundaries that even crisis situations could not overcome. The staff response to the initial phases of the uprising revealed fundamental weaknesses in both training and institutional culture that had developed over decades of routine operations, punctuated by periodic crises that were resolved through external intervention rather than internal capability and preparedness. The security personnel who remained at their posts during the early hours of the riot were operating according to protocols designed for conventional prison disturbances rather than coordinated attacks by individuals whose capabilities included superhuman strength, technological expertise, and psychological manipulation techniques that could compromise staff loyalty and operational effectiveness. The role that Batman played in the Asylum's crisis management reflected both his unique relationship with the facility's inmate population and the broader failure of official law enforcement agencies to develop effective responses to situations that exceeded the parameters of conventional police work. His decision to enter the facility alone, despite offers of support from other members of Gotham's law enforcement community, demonstrated both personal courage and recognition that the psychological dimensions of the crisis required approaches that prioritized understanding over force, negotiation over confrontation. Bane's systematic assault on Arkham Asylum during his campaign to break Batman represented a form of strategic warfare that treated the facility not as a medical institution or correctional facility, but as a crucial component of Gotham's crime-fighting infrastructure, whose destruction would serve broader tactical objectives. The timing of his attack, coordinated with his other operations against Batman's allies and resources, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how the asylum's functions were integrated into the city's overall security apparatus and how its compromise could create cascading failures throughout Gotham's defensive systems. The mass release of inmates that Bane orchestrated served multiple purposes beyond simple distraction or chaos creation, representing instead a calculated attempt to overwhelm Batman's capacity for response while simultaneously testing the individual capabilities and motivations of prisoners whose confinement had prevented their full potential from later being assessed or demonstrated. The selection of specific inmates for release reflected Bane's analysis of their likely behavior patterns and probable effectiveness as agents of destruction, while his retention of certain individuals suggested strategic thinking about future operations and long-term campaign objectives. The psychological impact that mass escapes had upon Gotham's civilian population extended far beyond immediate safety concerns to encompass broader questions about institutional reliability and social contract effectiveness that shook public confidence in governmental capacity to provide basic security and protection. The knowledge that the city's most dangerous criminals were at large, combined with evidence of the asylum's systematic security failures, created atmospheric conditions of fear and uncertainty that affected not only individual behavior but also collective decision-making processes at every level of society. The weeks-long manhunt that followed each major breakout revealed both the extraordinary challenges posed by fugitives whose capabilities exceeded normal criminal parameters and the limitations of law enforcement resources and methodologies when confronted with individuals who possessed superhuman abilities, advanced technology, or psychological skills that enabled them to evade capture despite intensive pursuit efforts. The recapture operations required unprecedented cooperation between multiple agencies and jurisdictions, while consuming resources that might otherwise have been devoted to preventing new crimes or addressing ongoing social problems. The physical and psychological exhaustion that Batman experienced during extended recapture campaigns demonstrated how the asylum's failures created burdens that exceeded the capacity of any individual hero to bear indefinitely, regardless of their personal capabilities or dedication to justice and public safety. The cumulative effect of repeated crises and constant emergency response requirements prevented long-term planning and strategic thinking that might have addressed root causes of institutional failure rather than merely responding to their most visible symptoms. The temporary relocation of inmates to Blackgate Penitentiary during repair and reconstruction periods created new problems that reflected the fundamental incompatibility between conventional correctional facilities and the specialized needs of prisoners whose conditions and capabilities required medical supervision and psychiatric treatment rather than simple custodial care. The mixing of Arkham inmates with regular prison populations led to incidents of violence and corruption that contaminated both institutional cultures while creating security vulnerabilities that persisted long after the temporary arrangements had ended. The discovery of Mercy Island as an alternative location for the asylum represented both opportunity for institutional renewal and continuation of patterns that had characterized previous facilities, with geographic isolation serving both therapeutic and security purposes, while also creating conditions that enabled abuse and misconduct to flourish without external oversight or accountability. The Gothic architecture of the Mercy Mansion provided atmospheric continuity with previous incarnations of the asylum, while incorporating modern security features and treatment capabilities that reflected evolving understanding of psychiatric care and institutional management. The federal crisis that left Gotham City temporarily abandoned by official authority created conditions where the asylum's staff were forced to choose between personal safety and professional duty, a situation that revealed how institutional loyalty was ultimately subordinate to individual survival instincts when confronted with genuine existential threats. The mass desertion of personnel during the no man's land period left inmates to govern themselves according to their own rules and social structures, creating natural experiments in group dynamics and leadership that provided insights into criminal psychology while also demonstrating the fundamental importance of external authority in maintaining institutional stability. The Joker's decision to remain in the abandoned asylum during the citywide evacuation reflected both his psychological attachment to the institution and his understanding of its symbolic importance within Gotham's mythology and social structure. His transformation of the facility into his personal headquarters during the crisis period demonstrated how quickly institutional spaces could be repurposed for criminal activities when official oversight and security measures were removed, while his eventual destruction of the building through arson revealed his recognition that some transformations were so complete that restoration of previous functions became impossible. The year-long closure of the facility following its destruction created a gap in Gotham's criminal justice system that was filled by improvised arrangements and temporary measures that proved inadequate to address the ongoing need for specialized psychiatric care and security containment of dangerous individuals. The absence of a dedicated facility for criminal commitment and treatment led to overcrowding in conventional prisons and hospitals, while creating legal complications that affected prosecution strategies and judicial decision-making throughout the region. The pattern of destruction and rebuilding that characterized the asylum's history reflected deeper cycles of crisis and renewal that seemed to be inherent in any institution that attempted to address the intersection of mental illness and criminal behavior, particularly when dealing with populations whose capabilities and motivations exceeded the parameters that conventional facilities were designed to handle. Each reconstruction effort incorporated lessons learned from previous failures while also introducing new vulnerabilities and systemic weaknesses that would eventually be exploited by future uprising and escape attempts. The role that external criminal organizations played in facilitating and supporting asylum riots revealed the existence of intelligence networks and resource-sharing arrangements that connected incarcerated individuals with active criminal enterprises throughout Gotham and beyond. The coordination between inmates and outside allies demonstrated levels of communication capability and operational planning that suggested sophisticated criminal infrastructures capable of penetrating even maximum security institutional environments through corruption, technological innovation, and exploitation of procedural weaknesses. The investigation reports that followed major incidents consistently identified systematic failures in staff training, security protocols, and administrative oversight that created conditions conducive to rebellion and escape. Yet, the implementation of recommended reforms was repeatedly hindered by budget constraints, political considerations, and resistance from institutional cultures that prioritized stability over change. The recurring nature of these failures suggested that the problems were not merely technical or administrative, but reflected fundamental contradictions between the asylum's multiple missions and the resource limitations that constrained its operations. The psychological analysis of inmate behavior during riots revealed complex motivations that combined legitimate grievances about treatment and conditions with opportunistic desires for freedom and revenge, while also demonstrating how group dynamics could amplify individual pathologies and create collective behaviors that exceeded the sum of individual criminal capabilities. The emergence of temporary leadership structures during crisis periods showed how natural hierarchies developed among criminal populations when official authority structures were disrupted or eliminated. The ultimate significance of these recurring rebellions lay not in their immediate disruption of institutional operations or their temporary success in compromising security measures, but in their demonstration that the fundamental premise underlying Arkham Asylum's existence, the possibility of containing and treating individuals whose capabilities and motivations placed them beyond conventional social boundaries, might itself be flawed and unworkable within existing legal, medical, and administrative frameworks that had been designed for more manageable populations and more limited challenges than those presented by Gotham's extraordinary criminal community. The therapeutic methods employed within Arkham Asylum's walls represented a grotesque perversion of medical science, where treatments designed to heal the human mind were systematically corrupted into instruments of control, punishment, and psychological warfare that served institutional convenience rather than patient welfare. The evolution of these practices across decades of operation revealed how easily the noble ideals of psychiatric medicine could be subverted when applied within environments that prioritized containment over compassion, compliance over cure, and administrative efficiency over the sacred trust between healer and patient that forms the foundation of all legitimate medical practice. Ruth Adams' experimental approach to treating Harvey Dent's dissociative identity disorder represented one of the most psychologically damaging interventions ever implemented within the asylum's treatment programs, a methodology that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his condition while actively sabotaging his existing coping mechanisms in favor of theoretical constructs that had never been tested or validated through proper clinical research. Her decision to replace Dent's symbolic coin, which had provided him with a functioning decision-making framework despite its pathological origins, with a deck of playing cards, reflected a profound ignorance of how identity fragmentation actually operated within dissociative conditions, and the crucial role that external anchoring objects played in maintaining psychological stability. The underlying philosophy that guided Adams' intervention was rooted in a misguided belief that increasing the number of choices available to a patient would automatically result in improved decision-making capacity and greater psychological integration, a theory that ignored decades of research into decision paralysis, cognitive overload, and the specific neurological damage that had created Dent's condition in the first place. Her approach treated his dissociative episodes as simple indecision rather than recognizing them as manifestations of traumatic brain injury that had fundamentally altered his capacity for executive function and emotional regulation in ways that required careful support rather than chaotic disruption. The observable deterioration in Dent's condition following implementation of Adams' card-based therapy provided clear evidence of the treatment's harmful effects, yet institutional protocols that prioritized research data over patient welfare prevented immediate discontinuation of the intervention, despite mounting evidence of its destructive impact. The psychological fragmentation that resulted from forcing him to navigate dozens of possible choices for every decision created cascade effects that destabilized other aspects of his personality integration, while eliminating the binary framework that had previously allowed him to function with some degree of predictability and self-control. The ethical violations inherent in Adams' experimental approach extended beyond simple treatment failure to encompass fundamental breaches of informed consent, patient autonomy, and professional responsibility that revealed how thoroughly the asylum's institutional culture had abandoned legitimate medical principles in favor of academic curiosity and career advancement. Her willingness to subject a vulnerable patient to unproven interventions without adequate safety monitoring or discontinuation protocols demonstrated the kind of moral blindness that characterized much of the facility's approach to psychiatric treatment throughout its history. The electroshock therapy programs that were administered with such enthusiasm by Dr. Cavendish represented perhaps the most visible and horrifying example of how legitimate medical procedures could be transformed into instruments of torture when implemented by individuals whose motivations were more aligned with power and control than healing and compassion. The frequency and intensity of these treatments far exceeded any reasonable therapeutic protocol. While the selection criteria for patients who received them appeared to be based more on behavioral compliance issues than clinical indications or evidence-based treatment planning, the historical context of electroshock therapy's legitimate medical applications provided a thin veneer of respectability that concealed the systematic abuse that characterized its implementation within Arkham's walls. Where the procedure was employed not as a carefully monitored intervention for severe depression or catatonic states, but as a form of punishment for non-compliance with institutional rules and a method of behavioral modification that operated through fear and trauma rather than therapeutic mechanism. The absence of proper anesthesia, muscle relaxants, and post-treatment monitoring protocols that characterized standard medical practice revealed how completely the asylum had abandoned legitimate therapeutic approaches in favor of crude behavioral control methods. The psychological impact of witnessing or experiencing electroshock therapy within the asylum environment created secondary trauma effects that extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass other patients who were forced to observe or anticipate similar treatment, creating atmospheric conditions of terror and helplessness that were profoundly counterproductive to any legitimate therapeutic goals. The sounds and smells associated with the procedures, combined with the visible, physical, and psychological effects on those who underwent them, created sensory associations that could trigger panic attacks and regression in vulnerable individuals whose conditions already included elements of persecution, anxiety, and institutional paranoia. The corruption of informed consent procedures that surrounded electroshock therapy implementation reflected broader patterns of patient rights violations that characterized every aspect of the asylum's operations, where legal protections and ethical guidelines were systematically ignored or circumvented through administrative manipulation and exploitation of patients' compromised mental states. The use of temporary competency evaluations to justify treatment decisions that patients opposed when lucid demonstrated how psychiatric authority could be weaponized to override individual autonomy and self-determination in ways that by so 6 would have been unacceptable in any other medical context. Hugo Strange's mind control experiments represented the ultimate expression of psychiatric hubris. Research programs that abandoned any pretense of therapeutic intent in favor of pure scientific curiosity about the mechanisms of consciousness and the possibilities for personality restructuring through chemical and technological intervention. His underground facilities beneath the asylum provided the physical infrastructure necessary for conducting research that violated every principle of medical ethics while advancing theoretical understanding of neurochemistry and behavioral modification in ways that served intelligence and military applications rather than patient care or public health. The subjects of Strange's experimental programs were selected not based on clinical need or therapeutic potential, but according to research criteria that prioritized scientific value over human welfare, with particular attention to individuals whose unusual psychological profiles or superhuman abilities might yield insights into consciousness and identity that could not be obtained through conventional research methodologies. The systematic dehumanization that characterized these selection processes revealed how easily medical professionals could rationalize the most extreme forms of exploitation when motivated by intellectual curiosity and protected from external oversight or accountability. The techniques that Strange employed in his personality restructuring experiments incorporated elements of classical conditioning, pharmaceutical manipulation, surgical intervention, and technological augmentation that pushed the boundaries of what human consciousness could endure while maintaining any recognizable connection to original identity and personal history. The success rates of these interventions, measured in terms of creating functional behavioral modifications, were remarkably high when evaluated according to purely technical criteria. Yet the human cost of achieving such results included the complete destruction of everything that had made the subjects unique individuals with personal agency and moral responsibility. The long-term effects of Strange's experimental programs extended far beyond the immediate research subjects to encompass broader questions about the nature of identity, free will, and moral responsibility that had profound implications for how society understood criminal behavior and psychiatric treatment. The existence of individuals whose personalities had been artificially reconstructed through technological and chemical means created legal and philosophical dilemmas that existing frameworks were wholly unprepared to address, while raising disturbing questions about the authenticity of any behavioral changes that resulted from such extreme interventions. Jeremiah Arkham's implementation of glass observation walls throughout the renovated facility represented his attempt to eliminate the hidden spaces and unsupervised interactions that had enabled previous abuses while creating transparency that would supposedly protect both patients and staff through constant visibility and monitoring. This panopticon approach to institutional design reflected contemporary trends in correctional architecture and behavioral psychology. Yet its application within a psychiatric setting created novel forms of psychological pressure that could exacerbate existing conditions while generating new forms of institutional trauma related to privacy violation and constant surveillance. The elimination of private spaces within the facility meant that patients were denied access to the solitude and reflection that were essential components of psychological healing and personal growth, while the constant visibility created performance pressures that prevented authentic emotional expression and encouraged the development of institutional personas that concealed rather than revealed underlying psychological processes. The glass walls that were intended to provide protection actually created fishbowl environments where patients became objects of continuous observation and analysis rather than subjects deserving of dignity and respect. The staff behavior modifications that resulted from constant visibility included both positive changes related to accountability and professionalism and negative adaptations that reflected the psychological stress of working under perpetual scrutiny while managing individuals whose conditions and behaviors required flexibility and spontaneous response rather than rigid adherence to observable protocols. The documentation requirements associated with the transparent environment created administrative burdens that consumed time and energy that might otherwise have been devoted to direct patient care, while the pressure to maintain professional appearances at all times prevented the development of genuine therapeutic relationships that required elements of vulnerability and authentic emotional connection. The use of psychiatric inmates for research purposes represented one of the most systematic and extensive violations of medical ethics in the asylum's history, with patient populations serving as convenient sources of research subjects for investigations that range from pharmaceutical testing to psychological experimentation to technological development programs that bore no relationship to B664, therapeutic goals, or patient welfare. The vulnerability of the inmate population, combined with their legal status as involuntarily committed individuals, created conditions that were particularly conducive to exploitation by researchers whose primary interests lay in advancing scientific knowledge rather than improving patient outcomes. The informed consent procedures that supposedly governed research participation were systematically compromised by the power dynamics inherent in the institutional setting, where patients' basic needs for food, Shelter, medical care, and human contact were controlled by the same individuals who sought their participation in research programs. The coercive potential of these arrangements was compounded by the patient's compromised mental states and limited understanding of research methodologies, statistical analysis, and long-term health implications of experimental interventions. The pharmaceutical testing programs that were conducted within the asylum served both legitimate research purposes related to developing new treatments for psychiatric conditions and more questionable investigations into behavioral modification, consciousness alteration, and chemical restraint methods that prioritized institutional convenience over patient welfare. The absence of proper control groups, placebo protocols, and long-term follow-up studies meant that much of this research generated data of questionable scientific value while exposing patients to potentially dangerous side effects and drug interactions that were poorly understood and inadequately monitored. The transformation of Harley Quinn from therapist to patient represented perhaps the most dramatic and psychologically complex example of how the asylum's institutional culture could corrupt even well-trained mental health. Professionals who entered the facility with genuine commitment to therapeutic principles and patient advocacy. Her initial assignment to treat the Joker was based on her demonstrated expertise in treating personality disorders and her reputation for innovative therapeutic approaches that had achieved success with difficult cases in conventional clinical settings. The seduction process that ultimately led to Quinn's psychological breakdown and criminal transformation operated through mechanisms that were far more subtle and psychologically sophisticated than simple romantic attachment or Stockholm Syndrome, incorporating elements of professional validation, intellectual challenge, and gradual erosion of ethical boundaries that exploited her own psychological vulnerabilities while systematically undermining her professional identity and moral framework. The Joker's manipulation of her therapeutic sessions demonstrated his profound understanding of psychological defense mechanisms and professional ego, using her desire to achieve breakthrough results with a challenging case to draw her into increasingly compromising situations and ethical violations. The institutional response to Quinn's obvious psychological deterioration revealed how thoroughly the asylum's administrative culture had abandoned its responsibility to protect staff members from the occupational hazards associated with intensive work with dangerous and manipulative individuals. The warning signs that should have triggered intervention and support services were ignored or rationalized away by supervisors who prioritized research data and case study material over staff welfare. While the isolation that characterized her work environment prevented colleagues from recognizing and addressing the progressive changes in her behavior and professional judgment, the violation of the Hippocratic Oath that characterized so many of the asylum's treatment programs represented not merely individual moral failures on the part of specific staff members, but systematic institutional corruption that had transformed medical authority into an instrument of control and punishment rather than healing and compassion. The promise to first do no harm became meaningless within an environment where patient suffering was routinely justified through appeals to research value, institutional security, or behavioral modification goals that served administrative convenience rather than therapeutic purpose. The comparison between Arkham's methods and historical psychiatric abuses revealed troubling continuities with practices that had been officially condemned and supposedly eliminated from modern medical practice, including the use of physical restraints as punishment rather than safety measures, the administration of painful procedures without adequate anesthesia or consent, and the systematic dehumanization of patients through language and behavior that treated them as objects of study rather than individuals deserving of respect and dignity. The long-term consequences of these therapeutic nightmares extended far beyond their immediate impact on specific patients to encompass broader questions about institutional accountability, professional responsibility, and the social contract that supposedly governed the relationship between medical authority and vulnerable populations who were dependent upon that authority for their basic needs and fundamental rights. The asylum's history demonstrated how easily noble intentions could be corrupted when implemented within systems that lacked adequate oversight, accountability, and commitment to the ethical principles that distinguished legitimate medicine from institutional abuse and exploitation. The phenomenon that Commissioner James Gordon so aptly characterized as Arkham Asylum's revolving door represented far more than a simple failure of institutional security or administrative competence, but rather the inevitable consequence of fundamental contradictions between the legal frameworks that governed criminal justice, the medical principles that supposedly guided psychiatric treatment, and the practical realities of managing individuals whose capabilities and pathologies exceeded the parameters that existing systems had been designed to address. The recurring cycle of commitment, escape, recapture, and renewed confinement that characterized the asylum's relationship with Gotham's most notorious criminals reflected deep-seated structural problems that no amount of administrative reform or technological enhancement could resolve without addressing the underlying assumptions and procedures that created these patterns of institutional failure. The legal mechanisms that enabled repeated commitments to Arkham Asylum operated through insanity defenses and competency evaluations that transformed criminal trials into psychiatric assessments, creating pathways for avoiding traditional punishment while establishing patterns of institutional cycling that served neither justice nor therapeutic purposes. The adversarial nature of these proceedings meant that psychiatric testimony was shaped more by legal strategy than clinical judgment, with mental health evaluations becoming weapons in courtroom battles rather than genuine assessments of treatment needs and rehabilitation potential. The insanity plea itself represented a profound philosophical compromise between competing theories of criminal responsibility and moral accountability, acknowledging that severe mental illness could impair judgment and volition, while maintaining legal frameworks that assumed rational decision-making and conscious choice as the foundations of criminal culpability. This compromise created categories of individuals who were simultaneously too sick to be held fully responsible for their actions and too dangerous to be released into community-based treatment programs, generating populations that required specialized institutions capable of providing both security and therapy. The competency standards that governed commitment proceedings were designed for conventional criminal defendants rather than individuals whose psychological profiles included elements of superhuman ability, technological expertise, or charismatic manipulation that could compromise the integrity of evaluation processes themselves. The assessment tools and diagnostic criteria that mental health professionals employed in these cases were based on research with normal populations and conventional criminal behaviors, creating systematic blind spots when applied to individuals whose capabilities and motivations exceeded established psychological parameters. The political pressures that influenced judicial decisions regarding Arkham commitments reflected broader public anxieties about crime and punishment that prioritized perceived safety over genuine rehabilitation or therapeutic praises. Intervention, creating incentives for judges to choose institutional confinement over community-based alternatives regardless of clinical recommendations or evidence regarding treatment effectiveness. The electoral considerations that shaped judicial behavior meant that decisions were often made on the basis of their political impact rather than their therapeutic merit or legal appropriateness. The budget constraints that chronically limited Arkham's operational capabilities created conditions where institutional resources were consistently inadequate to address the complex needs of patients whose conditions required intensive intervention, and long-term treatment commitment. The funding formulas that govern psychiatric facility operations were based on conventional patient populations and treatment modalities, failing to account for the extraordinary costs associated with containing and treating individuals whose security needs exceeded those of normal psychiatric patients while requiring specialized staff training and technological resources. The economic incentives embedded within Gotham's criminal justice system actually rewarded institutional failure rather than therapeutic success, with funding streams that depended upon maintaining certain patient census levels while providing financial support for facility operations, regardless of treatment outcomes or recidivism rates. The per-patient reimbursement structures that governed asylum financing meant that successful treatment and discharge actually reduced institutional revenue, creating perverse incentives that discouraged effective intervention while rewarding prolonged confinement and repeated readmissions. The corruption within legal and political systems that surrounded Arkham's operations included not only direct financial misconduct and influence peddling, but also more subtle forms of institutional capture that aligned the interests of various stakeholders around maintaining existing arrangements rather than pursuing genuine reform or improvement. The relationships between asylum administrators, judicial officials, law enforcement agencies, and political leaders created networks of mutual dependency that resisted changes that might threaten established power structures or financial arrangements. The prosecutorial strategies that were employed in cases involving Arkham inmates reflected pragmatic calculations about conviction rates and public safety rather than genuine commitment to justice or therapeutic intervention, with district attorneys often preferring plea agreements that resulted in asylum commitment over trials that might result in acquittals or sentences that would return dangerous individuals to the community more quickly. These prosecutorial choices were driven by career considerations and political calculations, rather than careful analysis of individual cases or evidence-based assessment of treatment needs and rehabilitation potential. The systematic failures in staff training and institutional culture that characterized Arkham's operations created conditions where personnel were unprepared to recognize or respond appropriately to signs of escape planning, institutional manipulation, or security compromise, while also lacking the therapeutic skills and ethical grounding necessary to provide genuine treatment rather than mere custodial care. The hiring practices that prioritized security experience over medical training created staff populations that were well equipped to manage conventional correctional situations, but poorly prepared to address the complex psychological and behavioral challenges posed by the asylum's unique patient population. The security protocols that governed daily operations within the facility were designed according to conventional correctional principles that assumed rational behavior and normal human capabilities, creating systematic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals whose abilities exceeded these assumptions or whose psychological profiles enabled them to manipulate staff members and institutional procedures in ways that conventional security measures could not anticipate or prevent. The technological systems that supported these protocols were similarly limited by their designers' assumptions about normal human behavior and conventional criminal methods. The relationship between Batman's activities and the asylum's cycling patterns represented one of the most complex and controversial aspects of Gotham's approach to criminal justice, with critics arguing that the vigilantes' methods actually perpetuated the problems they were intended to solve by capturing criminals in ways that made successful prosecution difficult while creating psychological dynamics that encouraged repeat offenses and ongoing criminal careers. The informal cooperation between Batman and asylum staff created accountability gaps that enabled both parties to avoid responsibility for systemic failures while maintaining arrangements that served their respective interests rather than broader public safety or therapeutic goals. The psychological profiles of repeat offenders revealed patterns of institutional dependency and learned helplessness that suggested prolonged asylum confinement actually reduced individuals' capacity for independent functioning while increasing their identification with criminal identities and antisocial behavior patterns. The institutional environments that were designed to promote rehabilitation instead created conditions that reinforced pathological thinking and maladaptive behavior while preventing the development of social skills and coping mechanisms that would be necessary for successful community reintegration. The staff complicity in escape attempts and security breaches included not only direct corruption and criminal collaboration, but also more subtle forms of negligence and willful blindness that reflected demoralization and cynicism among same B personnel who had lost faith in the institution's therapeutic mission, while remaining dependent upon their employment for financial security and professional identity. The turnover rates among clinical and security staff created conditions where institutional memory and expertise were constantly lost, while new employees were inadequately trained and poorly supervised. The community attitudes that surrounded the asylum's operations reflected broader social prejudices and fears regarding mental illness and criminal behavior that made genuine integration and rehabilitation nearly impossible even for individuals who achieved significant therapeutic progress during their confinement. The stigma associated with Arkham commitment meant that former patients faced discrimination in employment, housing, and social relationships that created pressures toward recidivism and return to criminal activities or institutional dependence. The legal precedents that accumulated through decades of Arkham-related court cases created jurisprudential frameworks that institutionalized the cycling patterns while making reform efforts more difficult by establishing expectations and procedures that assumed repeated commitment rather than successful treatment and community reintegration. The case law that developed around competency evaluations, treatment refusal rights, and civil commitment procedures created complex legal obstacles that prevented innovative approaches while protecting existing institutional arrangements from challenge or modification. The therapeutic philosophies that competed for influence within the asylum reflected broader debates within psychiatric medicine about the nature of mental illness, the effectiveness of various treatment modalities, and the proper balance between patient autonomy and institutional authority. Yet these intellectual discussions were consistently overshadowed by practical concerns about security and liability that prevented genuine experimentation with alternative approaches or innovative intervention strategies. The societal acceptance of institutional failure that characterized public discourse about Arkham Asylum reflected deeper cultural attitudes about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and social obligation that made genuine reform politically difficult while enabling continued operation of systems that served neither therapeutic nor public safety purposes effectively. The media coverage that surrounded asylum incidents typically focused on dramatic escapes and violent crimes rather than systemic problems or treatment failures, creating public awareness that reinforced support for security measures while ignoring underlying issues that contributed to cycling patterns. The academic research that examined Arkham's operations and outcomes was limited by restricted access to patients and records, ethical constraints on experimental interventions, and institutional resistance to external oversight or criticism, creating knowledge gaps that prevented evidence-based reform while enabling continued operation according to traditional practices that lacked empirical support or theoretical justification. The few independent studies that managed to penetrate institutional barriers consistently documented high recidivism rates, poor treatment outcomes, and systematic violations of patient rights, yet these findings had little impact on operational practices or policy decisions. The international comparisons that placed Arkham's performance in broader context revealed that similar institutions in other jurisdictions achieved significantly better outcomes through different approaches to treatment, security, and community integration. Yet these comparative studies had minimal influence on reform efforts due to political and professional resistance to acknowledging institutional failure or implementing changes that would require substantial resource investment and, quote, structural modification. The ultimate explanation for Arkham Asylum's revolving door phenomenon lay not in any single factor or policy failure, but in the complex interaction of legal, medical, political, economic, and social forces that created self-reinforcing cycles of institutional dysfunction, where each component of the system operated according to incentives and constraints that made genuine reform nearly impossible while ensuring continued operation of arrangements that served narrow institutional interests rather than broader therapeutic or public safety goals that had supposedly justified the facility's existence and continued public support. The tragic irony that emerged from decades of cycling patients through Arkham's programs was the recognition that the institution designed to heal the mentally ill had instead become a mechanism for perpetuating mental illness, criminal behavior, and social dysfunction, creating precisely the conditions that it had been established to eliminate while consuming vast resources that might otherwise have been devoted to prevention, early intervention, and community-based treatment approaches that offered genuine hope for rehabilitation and social reintegration. The ethereal dimensions that existed beyond the boundaries of rational perception had always pressed against the walls of Arkham Asylum with an insistence that grew stronger with each passing year, each accumulated tragedy, and each soul that surrendered its sanity within the institution's gothic embrace. These supernatural forces were not merely atmospheric curiosities or psychological projections born from the fevered imaginings of disturbed minds, but genuine metaphysical phenomena that operated according to principles that predated human understanding of reality, while drawing their strength from the concentrated suffering and spiritual corruption that had accumulated within the asylum's stones across generations of institutional horror and therapeutic malpractice. The binding spell that Amadeus Arkham had carved into the floor of his prison cell during his final incarceration represented far more than the desperate delusions of a mind destroyed by guilt and hereditary madness, but rather a sophisticated occult working that drew upon traditions of ritual magic and spiritual containment that stretched back to the earliest attempts by human consciousness to impose order upon chaos and meaning upon the trice. Incomprehensible forces that governed existence beyond the veil of material reality. The symbols that he had scratched into stone with his own fingernails over months of obsessive labor incorporated elements from multiple esoteric traditions, combining Christian mysticism with pre-Columbian shamanic practices and Hermetic philosophy in ways that suggested either profound scholarly research or direct revelation from otherworldly sources. The geometric patterns that comprised the spell's physical manifestation were designed to create what occult practitioners termed a binding circle, a metaphysical construct that could theoretically contain spiritual entities within specific spatial boundaries while preventing their influence from extending beyond designated perimeters. The accuracy of Amadeus's ritual construction, despite his deteriorating mental state and lack of proper tools or materials, indicated either remarkable preservation of intellectual faculties or supernatural guidance that enabled him to complete workings of extraordinary complexity and precision under conditions that should have made such achievements impossible. The target of this binding operation was what Amadeus consistently referred to as the Bat Thing, an entity that he believed was intimately connected to both his family's cursed destiny and the broader spiritual corruption that had transformed his noble vision of therapeutic sanctuary into a monument to human suffering and institutional failure. His journals from this period describe the creature not as a physical being, but as a manifestation of archetypal darkness that existed at the intersection between individual psychology and collective unconscious. A force that fed upon fear, madness, and moral corruption while using these energies to manifest increasingly powerful influences within the material world. The effectiveness of Amadeus's binding ritual remained a subject of debate among those few individuals who possessed both the occult knowledge necessary to evaluate his work and access to the asylum's hidden histories. Yet, the observable phenomena that occurred within the facility over subsequent decades suggested that his spiritual intervention had achieved at least partial success in containing forces that might otherwise have consumed not only the institution, but the entire city of Gotham. The periodic manifestations of supernatural activity that continued to occur within the asylum's walls appeared to follow patterns that respected certain boundaries and limitations, as if constrained by invisible barriers that prevented full expression of their malevolent potential. The pre-existing supernatural history of the sites that had housed various incarnations of Arkham Asylum suggested that the Arkham family's selection of locations for their therapeutic ventures had been guided by factors beyond mere practical considerations of isolation and privacy, with each successive facility being established upon ground that possessed metaphysical properties that attracted and concentrated otherworldly influences. The original Arkham Manor had been constructed upon land that indigenous peoples had traditionally avoided due to their understanding of its spiritual contamination, while Mercy Island had served as a burial ground for victims of plague and violence, whose restless spirits had never found peace or resolution. The geological characteristics of these locations included underground water sources, mineral deposits, and electromagnetic anomalies that created conditions conducive to what paranormal researchers termed spiritual activity, natural phenomena that seemed to facilitate communication between different planes of existence, while providing energy sources that could be utilized by entities seeking to manifest within physical reality. The limestone foundations that supported the various asylum buildings contained caves and underground chambers that had been used for ritual purposes by previous inhabitants, creating sacred spaces that retained spiritual significance long after their original users had disappeared from historical record. The ghostly apparitions that were regularly witnessed within the asylum's corridors represented not random hauntings or psychological projections, but organized manifestations of individuals whose deaths within the institution had been so traumatic or unjust that their consciousness had become permanently attached to the physical location where their suffering had reached its culmination. These spirits included not only patients who had died under suspicious circumstances, but also staff members whose exposure to the asylum's corrupting influences had ultimately claimed their sanity and their lives, creating a growing population of supernatural residents whose presence influenced the behavior and mental states of living inhabitants. The most frequently observed apparition was that of Elizabeth Arkham herself, whose tortured spirit had never found rest following her son's mercy killing, and whose manifestations were invariably associated with temperature drops, electromagnetic disturbances, and psychological effects that included feelings of profound sadness and existential despair. Her appearances seemed to follow patterns that correlated with periods of particular institutional crisis or moral corruption, suggesting that her spiritual presence served as a kind of supernatural conscience that responded to violations of the therapeutic principles that she had hoped would guide her son's creation. The unexplained phenomena that occurred with such regularity within the asylum's walls that staff members had ceased to report them included doors that opened and closed without human intervention, electrical systems that failed and restored themselves according to no identifiable pattern, and temperature fluctuations that created microclimates of impossible cold or heat in specific rooms or corridors. These manifestations appeared to be connected to the emotional states and activities of living inhabitants, with supernatural activity intensifying during periods of violence, cruelty, or particularly severe psychological trauma. The connection that existed between the asylum's supernatural manifestations and other dimensions of reality was most clearly evidenced through the periodic appearances of entities and phenomena that bore no resemblance to terrestrial life or natural physical processes, suggesting that the facility served as a kind of interdimensional nexus where the boundaries between different planes of existence had been worn thin through concentrated spiritual corruption and metaphysical contamination. These otherworldly visitors included beings of pure energy that could manipulate electronic systems and human consciousness, shadow creatures that existed in the spaces between light and darkness, and geometric forms that moved according to mathematical principles that violated established laws of physics. The occult symbols that had been carved into walls, floors, and structural elements throughout the asylum's various incarnations represented not random vandalism or the meaningless scribbles of disturbed minds, but sophisticated magical workings that incorporated elements from dozens of different esoteric traditions and represented centuries of accumulated occult knowledge and ritual practice. These symbols had been inscribed by individuals ranging from Amadeus Arkham himself to various patients and staff members who had been influenced by supernatural forces or driven by compulsions that originated from sources beyond normal. Psychological understanding. The protective wards that were discovered hidden within the asylum's architectural elements suggested that previous inhabitants had recognized the supernatural dangers associated with the facility and had attempted to create spiritual defenses that could shield living inhabitants from the worst effects of otherworldly influence and demonic contamination. These defensive measures included blessed objects concealed within wall cavities, protective symbols painted with materials that included human blood and other organic substances, and ritual circles inscribed in locations that corresponded to significant geometric relationships within the building's overall design. The influence that these supernatural elements exerted upon the asylum's patient population was both subtle and profound, creating atmospheric conditions that could exacerbate existing mental illness while also generating new forms of psychological disturbance that combined conventional psychiatric symptoms with spiritual possession, psychic sensitivity, and exposure to otherworldly forces that human consciousness was not equipped to process or understand. The treatment records that documented these cases typically attributed supernatural experiences to hallucinations or delusions. Yet the consistency of reports across multiple unconnected individuals suggested that patients were actually perceiving genuine phenomena rather than suffering from shared psychological disorders. The ancient curses that were believed to affect the asylum's operations drew their power from historical injustices and spiritual violations that had occurred upon the land across centuries of human habitation, including the displacement of indigenous peoples, the desecration of sacred sites, and the systematic oppression of individuals whose spiritual beliefs and practices had been condemned by dominant religious and social authorities. These accumulated spiritual debts created metaphysical conditions that attracted malevolent entities while repelling beneficial influences that might otherwise have provided protection and healing. The religious imagery that appeared throughout the asylum's architecture and decorative elements reflected attempts by various inhabitants to invoke divine protection against supernatural threats, while also providing focal points for spiritual practices that could theoretically counteract the facility's accumulated negative energy and metaphysical contamination. These Christian symbols and architectural features existed alongside elements from other religious traditions, creating syncretic spiritual environments that reflected the diverse backgrounds of patients and staff, while also providing multiple pathways for supernatural influence and intervention. The apocalyptic symbolism that characterized many of the asylum's supernatural manifestations suggested connections to eschatological traditions that viewed the facility as a significant location in cosmic struggles between forces of order and chaos, good and evil, creation and destruction that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of psychiatric treatment or criminal justice. The prophetic visions that were experienced by certain patients and staff members consistently depicted the asylum as a crucial battlefield in spiritual conflicts that would determine the fate of human civilization and the ultimate destiny of consciousness itself. The intersection between scientific and supernatural elements within the asylum's operations created unique conditions where empirical observation and metaphysical speculation could coexist and mutually reinforce each other. With research programs that incorporated both conventional medical methodologies and occult practices in attempts to understand and manipulate forces that operated according to principles that transcended normal physical laws. These hybrid approaches to knowledge and intervention created opportunities for breakthrough discoveries, while also opening doorways to forms of corruption and spiritual contamination that could destroy both individual practitioners and barely entire institutional cultures. The thin boundary between different planes of existence that characterized the asylum's metaphysical environment meant that individuals who spent extended periods within the facility were exposed to influences and experiences that could fundamentally alter their understanding of reality, while providing access to knowledge and capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. These supernatural exposures could result in enhanced psychic abilities, prophetic visions, and spiritual insights, yet they also carried risks of possession, madness, and spiritual corruption that could prove far more damaging than any conventional form of mental illness or psychological trauma. The ultimate significance of Arkham Asylum's supernatural dimensions lay not in their dramatic manifestations or their impact upon individual patients and staff members, but in their demonstration that the facility existed at the intersection of multiple realities and served functions that extended far beyond its official mission of providing psychiatric treatment and criminal containment, operating instead as a kind of spiritual filter or metaphysical processing center that channeled otherworldly influences into the material world while serving as a testing ground for forces and principles that would ultimately determine the future evolution of human consciousness and spiritual development. The digital revolution that transformed every aspect of human society during the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought to Arkham Asylum both unprecedented opportunities for therapeutic innovation and novel vulnerabilities that criminal minds could exploit with devastating effectiveness, creating technological landscapes where healing and harm existed in constant tension, while the institution struggled to adapt methodologies designed for analog environments to challenges that demanded entirely new approaches to security, treatment, and patient care. The integration of computer systems, surveillance networks, and electronic medical records promised to revolutionize psychiatric treatment through improved data analysis and coordination. Yet these same technologies created attack surfaces that could be penetrated by individuals whose technical expertise far exceeded that of the administrators responsible for protecting institutional systems and patient welfare. The computerized patient management systems that were implemented throughout the 1990s represented significant advances in record-keeping accuracy and treatment coordination, enabling staff members to access comprehensive patient histories and coordinate care across multiple departments and shifts, while maintaining detailed documentation of therapeutic interventions and behavioral observations that could inform future treatment planning and research activities. These electronic systems replaced paper-based records that had been vulnerable to loss, damage, and unauthorized alteration. Yet they also created centralized databases that could be compromised through cyber attacks, insider threats, or simple technical failures that might render critical information inaccessible during emergency situations when such data was most urgently needed. The security cameras and electronic monitoring equipment that proliferated throughout the facility during this period provided administrators with unprecedented visibility into patient activities and staff behavior while creating permanent records of incidents that could be analyzed for patterns and used to improve operational procedures and crisis response protocols. The psychological impact of constant surveillance upon both patients and staff was complex and often contradictory, with some individuals feeling safer under continuous observation, while others experienced the monitoring as a form of psychological pressure that inhibited authentic behavior and therapeutic communication, while reinforcing institutional power dynamics that could be counterproductive to healing relationships. The automated systems that controlled facility infrastructure, including lighting, ventilation, security doors, and emergency equipment, offered improved efficiency and reliability compared to manual operations while providing centralized control that could theoretically enhance safety and security during crisis situations. Yet these same automated systems created single points of failure that could be exploited by technically sophisticated inmates or external attackers who understood how to manipulate computer networks and electronic controls to create chaos, facilitate escapes, or compromise safety systems that staff members and patients depended upon for protection from both internal and external threats. The introduction of electronic communication systems, including internal networks, internet connectivity, and digital telephone systems, enabled improved coordination between different parts of the facility, while providing access to external resources and expertise that could enhance treatment quality and operational effectiveness. These communication capabilities also created pathways through which sensitive information could be transmitted to unauthorized recipients, whether through deliberate security breaches or inadvertent disclosure that violated patient confidentiality and institutional security protocols, while potentially exposing operational vulnerabilities that criminal organizations could exploit. The electronic medical devices that were increasingly integrated into patient care included monitoring equipment that could track vital signs and neurological activity in real time, pharmaceutical dispensing systems that could improve medication accuracy and reduce human error, and therapeutic devices that could deliver precisely calibrated treatments while maintaining detailed records of patient responses and outcomes. The reliability and accuracy of these technological tools often exceeded that of human operators. Yet their complexity and interconnectedness created new forms of vulnerability, where system failures or malicious interference could have catastrophic consequences for patient safety and treatment effectiveness. The adaptation to metahuman inmates required technological innovations that went far beyond conventional, correctional, or medical equipment, with containment systems designed to address superhuman strength, energy projection abilities, telepathic powers, and other extraordinary capabilities that rendered traditional security measures ineffective or potentially dangerous to both inmates and staff members. The development of these specialized technologies required collaboration with external contractors and researchers who possessed expertise in areas ranging from advanced materials science to theoretical physics, creating security challenges related to protecting classified information and preventing technology transfer to unauthorized parties. The cybersecurity threats that emerged as digital systems became more prevalent and sophisticated included not only external attacks by criminal organizations and foreign governments, but also internal threats from patients whose technical expertise could be applied to penetrating institutional networks and compromising sensitive systems. The educational backgrounds of some inmates included advanced degrees in computer science, engineering, and related fields. while others had acquired practical skills through criminal activities that involved electronic fraud, identity theft, and network intrusion techniques that could be adapted to institutional environments. The social media presence that the asylum was forced to develop and manage reflected broader changes in public communication and information sharing that made institutional privacy and secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain, while creating new channels through which misinformation and conspiracy theories could spread and damage institutional reputation and public confidence. The official accounts and communication strategies that were implemented to counter negative publicity often inadvertently provided additional information that could be analyzed and exploited by hostile parties seeking to identify operational patterns and security vulnerabilities. The digital medical records that replaced traditional paper-based systems enabled more sophisticated analysis of patient data and treatment outcomes, while providing researchers with access to large datasets that could support evidence-based improvements in therapeutic approaches and institutional policies. The privacy and security protections that were supposed to govern access to these electronic records were frequently inadequate to prevent unauthorized disclosure or misuse of sensitive information. While the integration of different database systems created opportunities for data corruption and systematic errors that could compromise treatment decisions and patient safety, the telemedicine capabilities that were developed to provide access to specialized expertise and reduce the costs associated with transporting dangerous patients to external facilities created new possibilities for therapeutic innovation, while also introducing technical vulnerabilities that could be exploited to gain unauthorized access to treatment sessions and confidential medical information. The encryption and security protocols that protected these remote communications were often inadequate to prevent interception or manipulation by sophisticated adversaries who possessed advanced technical capabilities and specific intelligence about institutional communication systems and procedures. The automated pharmaceutical systems that were implemented to improve medication accuracy and reduce human error in drug dispensing included computerized inventory management, prescription verification, and administration tracking that could theoretically eliminate many of the mistakes and intentional violations that had characterized traditional pharmacy operations. These technological improvements also created new opportunities for system manipulation and medication diversion that could be exploited by individuals who understood how to compromise computer networks and database systems while maintaining the appearance of normal operational procedures. The integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems into various aspects of asylum operations promised to revolutionize both patient care and institutional management through automated analysis of behavioral patterns, predictive modeling of treatment outcomes, and optimization of resource allocation and staff scheduling. The algorithms that powered these systems were often based on training data and assumptions that reflected historical biases and institutional prejudices, potentially perpetuating discrimination and inadequate care while creating illusions of objectivity and scientific rigor that could mask subjective judgments and political considerations. The electronic communication monitoring systems that were implemented to intercept and analyze patient communications included both officially sanctioned surveillance programs designed to prevent criminal coordination and unauthorized monitoring that violated patient privacy rights and legal protections governing confidential communications between patients and their attorneys, family members, and medical providers. The technical capabilities that enabled these monitoring systems often exceeded the legal authorities and ethical guidelines that were supposed to govern their use, creating opportunities for abuse and misconduct that were difficult to detect and prosecute. The public perception management challenges that arose from increased media coverage and citizen journalism meant that institutional incidents and controversies could be documented and disseminated through social media platforms and independent news sources that operated outside traditional editorial controls and fact-checking procedures. The institutional response strategies that were developed to address negative publicity often involved attempts to suppress or discredit unfavorable coverage rather than addressing underlying problems and accountability issues that had generated public criticism and concern. The corporate influence that increased as technological systems became more complex and expensive included partnerships with private companies that provided equipment, software, and technical support services while also seeking to expand their market share and influence institutional decision-making processes in ways that prioritized commercial interests over patient welfare and public safety. Considerations. The procurement procedures that governed these corporate relationships were often inadequate to prevent conflicts of interest and corruption, while ensuring that institutional needs and ethical obligations took precedence over vendor profits and political considerations. The privatization pressures that accompanied technological modernization included proposals to transfer various institutional functions to private contractors who claimed they could provide more efficient and cost-effective services, while maintaining or improving quality and safety standards. The track record of privatized correctional and medical facilities suggested that these claims were often exaggerated or false, with corporate operators frequently prioritizing profit margins over patient care while exploiting regulatory loopholes and political connections to avoid accountability for substandard performance and ethical violations. The staff training challenges that arose from technological complexity included the need to provide ongoing education about new systems and procedures, while maintaining expertise in traditional therapeutic and security methods that remained essential for effective patient care and institutional safety. The generational differences between older staff members who had learned their skills in analog environments and younger employees who were more comfortable with digital technologies created communication and coordination challenges that, quote, could affect institutional effectiveness and workplace culture. The patient adaptation difficulties that resulted from technological changes included challenges faced by long-term inmates who had become accustomed to traditional institutional routines and procedures while struggling to understand and navigate computerized systems and electronic interfaces that controlled access to basic services and communication opportunities. The digital divide that separated technologically literate patients from those who lacked such skills created new forms of inequality and discrimination within the institutional environment while potentially affecting treatment outcomes and rehabilitation prospects. The regulatory compliance challenges that accompanied technological implementation included requirements to meet data protection standards, accessibility guidelines, and safety regulations that were often poorly understood by institutional administrators, while being inadequately enforced by oversight agencies that lacked the technical expertise necessary to evaluate complex systems and identify potential violations or security vulnerabilities. The future challenges that loomed on the horizon included the potential for advanced artificial intelligence systems to make autonomous decisions about patient care and institutional security, while operating according to algorithms and decision-making processes that were too complex for human operators to understand or effectively oversee, creating accountability gaps and ethical dilemmas that existing legal and professional frameworks were wholly unprepared to address through conventional regulatory and oversight mechanisms that had been designed for human-controlled institutions and traditional therapeutic relationships. The cultural phenomenon that Arkham Asylum represented in the broader landscape of American consciousness extended far beyond its fictional origins to become a powerful symbol that shaped public discourse about mental illness, criminal justice, and institutional authority, while influencing real-world policies and attitudes towards psychiatric treatment and social responsibility for society's most vulnerable members. The asylum's representation across multiple forms of media, from comic books and graphic novels to television series and blockbuster films, created a shared cultural vocabulary that enabled complex discussions about topics that might otherwise remain hidden behind professional jargon and bureaucratic euphemism. Yet this same cultural prominence also risked perpetuating harmful stereotypes and misconceptions that could damage public understanding of mental health issues and therapeutic possibilities. The literary analysis that scholars and critics applied to Arkham's various incarnations revealed sophisticated narrative structures and thematic elements that connected the fictional institution to broader traditions of Gothic horror, social commentary, and psychological exploration that stretched back to the earliest examples of Western literature and mythology. The Asylum's architectural descriptions evoked classical images of liminal spaces where the boundaries between order and chaos, reason and madness, civilization and barbarism could be explored and challenged, while its recurring cycles of destruction and reconstruction reflected archetypal patterns of death and rebirth that resonated across cultures and historical periods. The academic studies that examined Arkham's cultural impact included interdisciplinary research that drew upon fields ranging from literary criticism and media studies to psychology and sociology, creating scholarly discourse that treated the fictional institution as a legitimate subject for serious intellectual inquiry, while generating insights that could inform both academic understanding and practical policy decisions regarding mental health care, and criminal justice reform. These scholarly investigations revealed how popular culture narratives could both reflect and shape social attitudes toward complex issues that affected millions of real people whose lives were touched by mental illness and institutional care. The influence that Arkham's fictional portrayal exerted upon real-world psychiatric reform movements included both positive effects that increased public awareness and support for improved treatment, while also generating negative consequences that reinforce stigmatization and fear of mental illness among populations that might otherwise have been more supportive of therapeutic approaches and community-based alternatives to institutional confinement. The dramatic and sensationalized elements that made Arkham compelling as entertainment often emphasized the most extreme and unusual aspects of psychiatric conditions, while minimizing the mundane realities of treatment and recovery that characterized most real-world mental health interventions. The advocacy organizations that worked to improve mental health services frequently found themselves grappling with public perceptions that had been shaped by Arkham's fictional representation, requiring educational campaigns that could separate entertainment from reality while building support for evidence-based treatment approaches that bore little resemblance to the dramatic confrontations and supernatural phenomena that based Felfing characterized the Asylum's media portrayals. The challenge of combating misconceptions while maintaining public engagement with mental health issues required careful balance between acknowledging legitimate concerns about institutional abuse and promoting realistic understanding of therapeutic possibilities and success stories. The international recognition that Arkham achieved as a cultural symbol extended far beyond English-speaking audiences to encompass global communities that adapted the institution's imagery and themes to address local concerns about mental health care, social control, and institutional authority within their own cultural contexts and political systems. The translation and adaptation of Arkham-related materials revealed how universal themes of madness, healing, and social responsibility could be expressed through culture-specific symbols and narratives while maintaining core elements that resonated across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The tourism industry that developed around locations associated with Arkham's fictional history represented a complex phenomenon that combined legitimate interest in mental health history and Gothic architecture with more problematic elements of dark tourism that treated human suffering as entertainment, while potentially trivializing the real experiences of individuals who had been affected by institutional abuse and psychiatric mistreatment. The ethical considerations surrounding dark heritage tourism included questions about appropriate memorialization of tragic events and the responsibility of commercial enterprises to provide educational context rather than simple sensationalism. The merchandise and commercial products that capitalized upon Arkham's cultural recognition included everything from clothing and collectibles to video games and theme park attractions that transformed the institution's imagery into consumable entertainment, while often stripping away the social commentary and ethical complexity that had given the original narratives their depth and significance. The commodification of mental illness imagery through these commercial applications raised concerns about the normalization of stigmatizing representations while potentially reducing complex social issues to simplistic good versus evil narratives that obscured underlying systemic problems. The artistic interpretations that visual artists, musicians, and performance creators developed in response to Arkham's cultural presence included both works that engaged seriously with themes of mental illness and institutional authority, and others that employed asylum imagery primarily for shock value or aesthetic effect without deeper engagement with the social and ethical issues that the fictional institution had been created to explore. The distinction between thoughtful artistic commentary and exploitative sensationalism often depended upon the creator's intent and execution rather than simply the presence of disturbing or controversial imagery. The psychological research that examined the effects of Arkham's media representation upon public attitudes toward mental illness revealed complex patterns of influence that included both increased awareness and empathy among some audiences and reinforced prejudices and fears among others, with individual responses depending upon factors including personal experience with mental health issues, educational background, and cultural context that shaped how fictional narratives were interpreted and integrated into existing belief systems. The educational applications that incorporated Arkham's narratives into curricula and training programs included both appropriate uses that employed fictional scenarios to stimulate discussion about real-world issues and problematic applications that confused entertainment with factual information while potentially misinforming students about the realities of mental health treatment and psychiatric institutions. The development of effective educational materials required careful attention to distinguishing between fictional elements and realistic portrayals while using narrative engagement to promote understanding rather than sensationalism. The political discourse that invoked Arkham's imagery often employed the institution as a metaphor for governmental overreach, institutional corruption, or social breakdown. Yet these political applications frequently oversimplified complex policy issues while potentially stigmatizing mental health services and the individuals who depended upon them for treatment and support. The use of mental health imagery in political rhetoric required careful consideration of how metaphorical language might affect real people and policy decisions that determined the availability and quality of psychiatric care. The social commentary that critics and commentators developed around Arkham's cultural significance included analyses that situated the fictional institution within broader discussions about neoliberalism, deinstitutionalization, community care, and social responsibility for vulnerable populations, revealing how entertainment narratives could serve as vehicles for examining complex policy questions and social challenges that might otherwise remain abstract or invisible to general audiences. The technology industry's adoption of Arkham-related imagery and terminology in products ranging from computer security software to virtual reality experiences reflected the institution's penetration into popular consciousness while also raising questions about the appropriateness of using mental health imagery for commercial purposes that had no connection to actual therapeutic goals or social welfare considerations. The religious and spiritual interpretations that various communities developed in response to Arkham's themes included both thoughtful theological engagement with questions about suffering, healing, and social responsibility, and more problematic applications that employed mental illness imagery to support particular doctrinal positions or moral judgments that could contribute to stigmatization and discrimination against individuals with psychiatric conditions. The feminist analysis that scholars applied to Arkham's representation revealed gendered dimensions of institutional authority and psychiatric treatment that reflected broader patterns of social control and medical paternalism, while also examining how female characters within the narratives both challenged and reinforced traditional power structures and gender roles within therapeutic and correctional contexts. The racial and cultural criticism that examined Arkham's portrayal highlighted the predominantly white and Western perspective that informed most mainstream representations, while identifying opportunities for more diverse and inclusive narratives that could address mental health issues within different cultural contexts and address the specific challenges faced by marginalized communities in accessing appropriate psychiatric care and social support. The generational differences in how different age cohorts responded to Arkham's cultural presence reflected changing attitudes toward mental illness, institutional authority, and social responsibility, while also revealing how evolving media technologies and communication platforms affected the transmission and interpretation of cultural narratives across different demographic groups and social contexts. The ultimate significance of Arkham Asylum's cultural impact lay not in its entertainment value or commercial success, but in its demonstration of how fictional narratives could serve as powerful tools for exploring complex social issues, while also revealing the responsibility that creators and consumers of cultural content bore for ensuring that such explorations contributed to greater understanding and empathy, rather than perpetuating harmful stereotypes and misconceptions that could damage real lives and impede progress toward more effective and humane approaches to mental health care and social justice. The philosophical questions that emerged from contemplating Arkham Asylum's existence and operations transcended the immediate concerns of psychiatric treatment and criminal justice to encompass fundamental inquiries about the nature of human consciousness, the boundaries of social responsibility, and the mechanisms through which civilized societies attempted to define and maintain distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable forms of thought, behavior, and existence. These deeper investigations revealed how the fictional institution served as a microcosm for broader tensions between individual autonomy and collective security, between compassion and control, between the desire to heal and the impulse to contain that characterized humanity's ongoing struggle to create just and humane responses to the challenges posed by mental illness, social deviance, and the irreducible complexity of human psychology. The nature of madness itself became a central philosophical concern when examined through the lens of Arkham's operations, raising questions about whether mental illness represented genuine medical conditions that could be objectively diagnosed and treated, or whether categories of sanity and insanity were primarily social constructions that reflected the basin, values and prejudices of dominant cultural groups rather than scientific realities that existed independent of political and economic considerations. The history of psychiatric classification revealed how diagnostic criteria had changed dramatically over time and across cultures, with behaviors and thought patterns that were considered pathological in one context being accepted or even valued in another, suggesting that the boundary between normal and abnormal mental states was far more fluid and subjective than medical authority typically acknowledged. The societal definitions of sanity that governed commitment procedures and treatment decisions reflected complex negotiations between medical expertise, legal precedent, political expediency, and cultural tradition that often prioritized social order and institutional convenience over individual welfare and genuine understanding of psychological diversity and human flourishing. The power to declare someone mentally ill and subject them to involuntary treatment represented one of the most significant forms of authority that modern societies granted to their institutions. Yet this power was frequently exercised without adequate safeguards against abuse or systematic evaluation of its effectiveness in achieving stated therapeutic goals. The institutional power that psychiatric facilities wielded over their patients created conditions where medical authority could be used to suppress dissent, punish nonconformity, and eliminate inconvenient individuals from community life, while maintaining the appearance of humanitarian concern and scientific objectivity that concealed the political and social functions that such institutions actually served within. Broader systems of social control and population management. The history of psychiatric abuse revealed how easily therapeutic language could be employed to justify practices that bore no resemblance to genuine medical intervention while serving the interests of families, communities, and governments that sought convenient methods for managing troublesome individuals without acknowledging the coercive nature of their actions. The medicalization of deviance that characterize modern approaches to mental health treatment involved the transformation of behaviors and characteristics that had previously been understood as moral, spiritual, or social issues into medical problems that required professional intervention and institutional management. A process that expanded the scope of psychiatric authority while potentially obscuring the social and political factors that contributed to psychological distress and behavioral problems. This medicalization process often served to individualize problems that might be better understood as symptoms of broader social dysfunction while providing scientific legitimacy for interventions that might otherwise be recognized as forms of social control. The ethics of indefinite psychiatric detention raised profound questions about due process, individual rights, and the limits of state power that challenged fundamental assumptions about justice and human dignity within democratic societies that claim to value freedom and individual autonomy above collective security and administrative convenience. The legal frameworks that governed involuntary commitment typically provided fewer protections than those available to individuals charged with criminal offenses. Despite the fact that psychiatric detention could last for years or even decades while involving treatments and interventions that significantly altered personality, behavior, and cognitive function, the relationship between free will and determinism in criminal behavior became particularly complex when examining cases where mental illness appeared to influence or determine actions that violated social norms and legal standards, raising questions about moral responsibility and appropriate responses to harmful behavior that emerged from psychological conditions rather than conscious choice and deliberate malice. The tension between holding individuals accountable for their actions and recognizing the role of mental illness in shaping behavior created dilemmas that existing legal and medical frameworks were poorly equipped to resolve in ways that satisfied both justice and therapeutic considerations. The purpose of punishment versus rehabilitation in responding to criminal behavior reflected competing theories of human nature and social organization that shaped institutional policies and treatment approaches while influencing broader public attitudes toward crime, mental illness, and the possibility of genuine personal transformation through therapeutic intervention rather than punitive measures. The punitive impulse that dominated many approaches to criminal justice was often incompatible with therapeutic goals that required trust, cooperation, and voluntary participation in treatment processes that could not be effectively imposed through coercion or threats. The social responsibility that communities bore toward their most vulnerable members included obligations to provide adequate mental health services and support systems, while also protecting public safety and maintaining social order in payments. Ways that balanced individual needs with collective welfare considerations. The deinstitutionalization movement that began in the mid-20th century was motivated by legitimate concerns about institutional abuse and the rights of individuals with mental illness. Yet its implementation often failed to provide adequate community-based alternatives while creating new problems related to homelessness, criminalization, and neglect of individuals whose conditions required ongoing support and supervision. The corruption of healing institutions represented a particularly troubling form of moral failure that violated fundamental trust relationships between healers and patients, while demonstrating how easily noble purposes could be perverted. When institutional power was exercised without adequate oversight, accountability, or commitment to ethical principles that transcended immediate practical considerations and political pressures. The transformation of hospitals into prisons and healers into wardens reflected broader patterns of institutional corruption that extended far beyond psychiatric facilities to encompass educational, religious, and social service organizations that claim to serve humanitarian purposes while actually functioning as mechanisms of social control and political manipulation. The fine line between patient and prisoner in institutional settings revealed how easily medical authority could be employed to justify forms of confinement and treatment that bore little resemblance to voluntary healthcare relationships, while serving functions that were more closely related to criminal justice and social control than genuine therapeutic intervention. The legal status of individuals committed to psychiatric facilities often provided fewer protections and rights than those available to convicted criminals, despite the fact that many psychiatric patients had not been charged with or convicted of any criminal offense. The authority and control that medical professionals exercised within institutional settings created opportunities for abuse that were particularly difficult to detect and prosecute due to the vulnerable status of patients. The technical complexity of treatment decisions and the deference that legal and oversight systems typically showed to medical expertise and professional judgment. The asymmetrical power relationships that characterized institutional psychiatry made it extremely difficult for patients to advocate for themselves or challenge treatment decisions, while creating conditions where professional misconduct could flourish without effective accountability or consequences. The abuse of medical power within psychiatric institutions took forms that ranged from obvious physical and sexual violence to more subtle psychological manipulation and neglect that could be equally damaging while being more difficult to identify and address through conventional oversight and accountability mechanisms. The professional authority that shielded medical personnel from scrutiny also made it possible for systematic abuse to continue for years or decades without intervention, while victims were discredited through their psychiatric diagnoses and institutional status. The cyclical nature of trauma and institutional violence revealed how facilities that were designed to heal psychological wounds often became sources of additional trauma that reinforced existing mental health problems while creating new forms of psychological damage that could persist long after individuals left institutional care. The re-traumatization that occurred within therapeutic settings demonstrated fundamental contradictions between healing goals and institutional practices, while highlighting the importance of trauma-informed approaches that recognized how environmental factors and staff behavior could either support or undermine recovery processes. The questions about redemption and the possibility of cure that arose from examining long-term institutional populations included both practical concerns about treatment effectiveness and deeper philosophical issues regarding the nature of human personality, the possibility of genuine change, and the criteria that should be used to evaluate therapeutic success or failure in cases where improvement might be partial, temporary, or difficult to measure through conventional assessment methods. The reality that some individuals might require lifelong support and supervision raised difficult questions about the appropriate balance between optimism about human potential and realistic assessment of limitations and constraints that could not be overcome through any known therapeutic intervention. The institutional violence that characterized many psychiatric facilities operated through mechanisms that were both obvious and subtle, including physical restraints and forced medication, as well as psychological manipulation, isolation, and deprivation of basic human dignity that could be equally harmful, while being more easily disguised